From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio on the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're a longtime fan reliving these monumental events or a newcomer eager to understand wrestling's rich history, you're in the right place. This episode is packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises along the way. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. September 6, 1999 Observer Newsletter. The highs and lows of ratings. Doctor under investigation for prescribing drugs to wrestlers. Dave Meltzer. The television season of wrestling overexposure began this past week with both good and bad news. But when the numbers came in, virtually all the good news was limited to the World Wrestling Federation. On August 30th, despite being moved back to an 11 p.m. start on the Eastern Time Zone due to U.S. Open tennis, and only going head-to-head with Nitro in the Pacific Time Zone, Raw's rating was still larger than Nitro. This finished a week where Nitro the previous week had done its worst rating in years and probably had there been competition would have even beaten that mark, where Thunder did its all-time lowest rating, and figures to drop from there in future weeks due to the competition from SmackDown, and where WCW Saturday Night also did among its worst ratings in history. Raw finished with a 4.16 rating, 4.23 first hour, 4.09 seconds hour, and a 10.5 share, numbers that have to be considered exceptional given it being so late at night in a new time slot, particularly with their audience makeup of usually 38% under 17. Nitro, going unopposed aside from the West Coast, finished with a 4.00 rating, 3.30 first hour, 4.20 seconds hour, 4.46 third hour, and a 6.4 share. Going unopposed on the during a time period where wrestling has combined to draw ratings from 8.5 to 10.5 and drawing far less than half of the usual wrestling audience can't be viewed as any kind of a positive. The fact WCW going unopposed and coming from the Nassau Coliseum in the New York market put on a completely awful show to the largest audience it will draw at any time in the foreseeable future is nothing short of mind-boggling. When the match lineup was put on the boards at about 6:30 p.m. before Nitro, the wrestlers were shaking their heads almost in disbelief that they would put on such a weak lineup of matches on a night when they had a chance to pick up some momentum and before the New York audience. The NFL game, a strong marquee matchup with the defending Super Bowl champion Denver Broncos versus Dallas Cowboys, drew a 9.13 rating opposing Nitro and not Raw, basically the identical number it did the week before when it did have competition from Raw, showing Raw's impact on the NFL numbers, even in preseason, is negligible. There really isn't much to say about the quarter hours, because without opposition, the numbers should have logically grown throughout on Nitro and tailed off slightly as the night got later on Raw, which pretty well is what happened. Bad news is the first hour was the lowest rated first hour since Nitro went to the 3-hour format. This basically shows that if Raw was on the air, Nitro probably would have been lucky to do more than about a 2.8 or 2.9 overall rating. Nitro picked up nearly a full point in the second hour, when it usually drops a full point, largely on traditional Raw viewers who decided to watch Nitro because it was their Monday night habit. The Nitro main event with Hogan and Goldberg versus the Jersey Triad drew a 4.81 rating, Nitro's high point of the show, but actually fell with no opposition in the overrun slightly to a 4.61, which is not good. With no opposition, the rating over the last 2 hours, once the traditional Raw audience switched over, stayed in the 4.2 to 4.5 range until the main event. The U.S. Open, in Raw's usual time slot, delivered a 1.02 rating and 1.7 share, which even with the fact advertisers are far more willing to sponsor tennis over pro wrestling due to its more favorable demographic profile. Still, it would be hard to believe makes it a more lucrative time slot for USA to preempt Raw's for a 1.0 even with the prestige that holding the U.S. Open contract brings to the network. The other night of competition, Thursdays, saw WWF SmackDown, which was largely a clone of Raw with a new set, debut to a 4.16 rating and 7.2 share on the UPN network. While some in WWF expressed minor disappointment with the numbers, it beat out the 4.0 that the highest rated show of the previous week on UPN delivered. Of course, with all the millions spent by UPN and hyping SmackDown as the savior of the network, 40% of the company's ad budget for the fall season was for SmackDown, it was expected to be by far the highest rated show on the network. UPN during the 2 hours finished in 4th place among the networks, behind NBC's traditionally strong shows, ABC and Fox, but beating a preseason football game on CBS and WB. It didn't come close to being the 3rd highest rated primetime show of the night as Vince McMahon had predicted it would open as and in 1 year be number 2, and in 2 years would be the fighting for the highest rated primetime show of the night. Thunder, which did nothing to counter-program the debut of SmackDown, going with a Benoit and Saturn vs. Sid and Rick Steiner main event and little else against WWF's Triple H vs. Rock title match, fell to a 1.94 rating and 3.3 share, numbers that are expected to fall even farther in future weeks. ECW had a roller coaster ride of a week. It started off low, with a poor series of house shows in Georgia and morale way down after a bad television taping in Toledo, which was to be the first TNN show. A correction from last week: the proposed and originally scheduled August 13th and August 20th TNN shows were cancelled by mutual agreement of TNN and Paul Heyman because so much of the promotion was built around an August 27th start. By the end of the week, the promotion was sky high. The return of Raven, who was given a limited release by WCW after Eric Bischoff's nutty escapade on August 23rd, to where he could work ECW but not WWF until his WCW contract expires in about 10 months, resulted in his signing with ECW and debuting on August 26th in Queens, New York. In what was generally hailed as one of the best shows in company history, Heyman ditched the Toledo tapings for TNN. 1 hour will air in syndication, and taped 2 hours from Queens before a rapid audience. Before the show started, Heyman got the crowd going by saying if they were enthusiastic enough, he wouldn't show the Toledo tapings on TNN and would air 2 hours from Queens on September 3rd and September 10th. The crowd in Queens, which needed no prompting to begin with to be enthusiastic, was going crazy the entire night, making for a tremendous television audience. Heyman basically replayed an angle from a few weeks ago, where Bubba Ray and Devon Dudley, in their last night with the company, they debuted on August 30th in Boston for WWF as part of the taping for the syndicated Jacked, formerly Shotgun show, won the tag titles from Balls Mahoney and Spike Dudley and were going to leave to present the belts to Vince McMahon when they joined the WWF. Heyman ended the show with the Dudleys calling out Tommy Dreamer, who was injured, which wound up with Dreamer trying to fight both guys until Raven came through the crowd to what is said was the biggest pop in ECW history, and Raven and Dreamer simultaneously DDT'd and pinned the Dudleys to capture the tag titles, with the show ending with the dressing room emptying and everyone hugging the Dudleys for a post-show celebration. The TNN debut the next night, basically an introduction show to the product, was generally well received, with thoughts being the second show with the angles from Queens would start to set business on fire. The syndicated taping 2 nights later at the ECW Arena in Philadelphia saw Raven again get a monster pop, and was considered a hugely successful show, including a Rob Van Dam vs. Jerry Lynn match that was considered the best match the two have ever had. From starting low, enthusiasm couldn't have been higher. But then reality set in on August 30th. The ratings came in for the TNN debut, and 0.94 rating and a 1.8 share in a Friday night prime time slot. While some ECW apologists were trying to put a happy spin on this one, it was a pretty difficult task to pull off when you examine it closely. There is truth in the fact that it really doesn't matter where you are when the race starts and nobody remembers, it matters where you are when it finishes. And Cheers, one of the great shows in television history, started out as one of the lowest rated shows and ended up a top rated classic, and that's hardly the only example of that. Nevertheless, the bad news is that TNN was selling ads for the show based on a 1.9 rating, which means TNN is starting out with problems. TNN was publicly predicting a 2.0 rating for the debut, and talking about adding a second ECW show during the week if it could consistently stay at that level. ECW workers were talking about when, not if, ECW on TNN would surpass the ratings on Nitro, which could still happen at some point, but isn't going to be happening anytime soon. It can be noted the ECW show was the highest rated show on Friday night on the network, with Motor Madness doing in 0.42 as a lead-in and Roller Jam doing in 0.65 for its season-opening Quakes vs. Sundogs match afterwards, and in 0.60 for the follow-up Sundogs vs. Riot game. But it also has to be noted that TNN was averaging in 0.8 rating in 1999 in the ECW time slot with Roller Jam, numbers which were considered a huge flop because of how much hype and expense the network had put into funding the show. And in January, when Roller Jam debuted on Friday nights with far less hype and mainstream press than ECW opened up with, and without a built-in audience from having a previous fan base, unless you include the fact there were a lot of roller derby fans in 1971, it opened with a 1.7 rating its first week, and that rating was considered a disappointment and was received by the people in the company with very long faces. TNN sold ads for Roller Jam based on a 2.5 average, and that 1.7 fell to a 1.3, 1.1 and hovered around 0.7 when it finally settled in, meaning the network took a major financial bath on advertising, and in a sense ECW was brought in as a lead-in to try and save some company embarrassment over the decision to revive roller derby. The network was being conservative on ECW's predictions based on the lessons of Roller Jam. Unlike Roller Jam, it's doubtful ECW's numbers will show a steady decline since ECW has the built-in loyal audience, but the reality was shown that built-in audience and the power of the internet buzz on the company in the big picture was highly overrated, not as far as enthusiasm, but as far as sheer numbers. When Roller Jam with less hype and no base audience in the same time slot debuted to nearly twice the audience. Also, as expected, ECW as a lead-in did virtually nothing for Roller Jam's numbers, which stayed basically steady at the same level it had been doing for the entire 2 hours of the first 2 games of its new season. In other numbers for the first weekend of the new TV season, Livewire did a 1.6, Superstars did a 2.1, and Sunday Night Heat, with its new format, held up with a 4.09 rating. Heat, no longer a live arena show, is an exceptionally well-produced show built around a diet of music videos, some first-run interviews, and a featured event. The first feature was a tremendously produced feature, The Undertaker vs. Mankind Hell in the Cell match. It had Mankind out of character as Mick Foley, along with Undertaker out of his gimmick, Steve Austin. D'Lo Brown and the Hardy Boys talk about different spots in the match as they were shown. It was very compelling, and also really weird. Everyone except Undertaker talked about the match as if it was a performance, and an amazing one, by Foley by agreeing to take these insane bumps. Foley even said going in that the first Hell in the Cell match, which it would be compared with, was Undertaker vs. Shawn Michaels, which was a match of the year. He said with Undertaker going in injured, it was scared going in that they were going to stink up the place, and largely that fear is what caused him to go to such extremes and largely make himself a legend for all times. However, Undertaker talked of it as if it was a legit fight, in 80s terms of how he knew he was in for a hard fight and how when Mankind would get up, he realized again what a difficult fight he was having. At the end, Foley said he's really sick of talking about the match and people bringing it up, noting he's had a lot of other great matches that people don't talk about. WCW Saturday Night did a 1.5 rating, again the lowest rated Saturday night show on TBS that day. The September 6th issue of Business Week ran a story about NBC's hold on Thursday night prime time, which generates 38% of total network ad revenue because of its strong history, but with Seinfeld ending its run, NBC's numbers on Thursday overall dropped 16% last season, largely due to Frasier dropping 26% from the Seinfeld level. It noted UPN's mass expenditure to promote wrestling, and perhaps showed the generation gap when it noted the WWF's top star as Stone Cold Steve Phillips. The fact a reporter may not know who Steve Austin is one thing, but the fact that none of the proofreaders did either shows that while Austin is already a cultural icon to those under 25, he's still not all that recognizable a name to older age groups. The Los Angeles Business Journal categorized UPN's SmackDown to both programming genius by the network and also last-ditch survival effort. UPN suffered $180 million last season in losses, and there were rumblings its co-owners, Viacom and Chris Kraft Industries, were close to dumping the network, so they need a desperation move. Dr. Joel Hackett, an Indianapolis physician well known within pro wrestling for having connections with some of the biggest name WWF and WCW talent, had his medical license suspended for at least 90 days this past week, and an Indiana State Police investigation has been turned over to the Marion County Prosecutor's Office for potential criminal charges. Hackett, known to have medical connections with both Brian Pillman and Louis Spicolli, admitted in a June 4, 1998 interview with Indiana State Police investigator Mike Garrett, prescribing Schedule II, III and IV controlled substances to pro wrestlers 8 to 10 different states and Canada for 6 years. Garrett's report said that 3 of Hackett's patients, names not listed, but one of which would have been Spicolli, had overdosed with many of Hackett's prescription pills around at the scene of the death. There are both similarities and differences between this story, which originally broke in the August 28 Indianapolis Star/News, and what it will be naturally compared with, the steroid/controlled substance painkillers distribution conviction of Dr. George Zahorian in 1991. The Zahorian case turned out to have far-reaching implications beyond Zahorian's 2-plus-year prison sentence, including the publicity coming from it leading to the WWF instituting steroid testing from late 1991 through early 1997, when it ceased testing except on very rare occasions, being one of the key factors in the decline of wrestling's popularity from 1992 and 95. Not necessarily the bad pub leading to the decline, although it was a factor, but factors stemming from this including the WWF's inability to promote as well with a stable of generally smaller bodies, although there has been plenty of public statements showing that there were steroid-enhanced bodies working on top during that so-called steroid-free period, And it directly led to the conspiracy to distribute steroids to WWF wrestlers' trial of Vince McMahon in 1994, a charge McMahon was acquitted of by a Nassau County jury. The similarities are of course a doctor allegedly prescribing controlled substances without medical need to famous wrestlers, and that once again it has been somewhat verified what everyone knows on the inside, that pro wrestling has hardly cleaned up its drug problems. The differences are that none of Zahorian's so-called patients ever died under his care, and also, that the attitude of the World Wrestling Federation when it came to Hackett was entirely different than Zahorian. Zahorian sold steroids and other drugs, mainly painkillers, without prescriptions to the biggest stars in the WWF, including Hulk Hogan, Vince McMahon, and Roddy Piper. While Hackett was connected to many huge stars in the industry, is not believed to be personalities quite at that level. However, this story is breaking at a time when the mainstream media covers pro wrestling, whereas the Zahorian trial was not a huge story in most places, even with Hogan, McMahon and Piper's names connected, because pro wrestling wasn't as popular and was shunned by mainstream journalism. According to Rich Herring of WWFE in a local newspaper interview, as early as 1995 the company banned Hackett from coming backstage and being in contact with its wrestlers. Still, other WWFE officials acknowledged knowledge that at least two company wrestlers, one with a long history of drug problems and health problems relating to such, much to the chagrin of the company, were still in contact with Hackett in recent months. It is believed that it actually was after the death of Pillman on October 5, 1997, who was known by company officials for having a connection with Hackett, that several known doctors that were prescribing pain pills to wrestlers were sent letters banning them from going backstage at WWF events. Both Hackett and a California physician, Dr. Jeff Unger, took the news the hardest. Unger had previously shilled for the company in a television angle selling a supposed career-ending injury by Shawn Michaels, which was led to his big comeback and championship year in 1996. Hackett, who is African American, claimed racial discrimination when he was given the news and had threatened to sue the company. After those threats, the WWF turned its own records pertaining to Hackett, which apparently included documentation of prescribing steroids to wrestlers, which also implicated some of its own talent, to both the AMA and the DEA, and some company officials never understood why neither agency had up until this point acted on the evidence given them. After banning Hackett from the dressing rooms didn't result in wrestlers stopping their dealings with him, the WWF sent a memo warning wrestlers to avoid dealing with Hackett in 1997. Some wrestlers actively protested, claiming the company was trying to tell wrestlers what doctors they could or couldn't go to for ailments. Hackett was still regularly getting comp tickets to attend WWF events from wrestlers dealing with him, although he wasn't allowed backstage, until the company banned wrestlers from calling in comps for him. Hackett was also backstage many times at WCW shows, and it was believed that certain headline wrestlers were flying him to major events in cities like Las Vegas and San Francisco even after the death of Spicoli. Hackett, who couldn't be reached for comment, had his license suspended once and was on medical probation for lewd and immoral conduct in 1997, according to documents filed with the Medical Licensing Board. The Indiana Attorney General's office, which is investigating the case involving the wrestlers, although at this point no criminal charges have been filed, publicly linked Hackett with the WWF, although up to this point no media has linked him with WCW, but there is a known connection, including former WWF wrestlers, like Spicoli, who were later employed by WCW after his license was suspended on August 26. Hackett, at the June 4, 1998 interview with the Indiana State Police and the DEA, voluntarily surrendered his right to prescribe controlled substances after his admissions in the interview. His license was suspended by the board after allegations he continued to write prescriptions months after surrendering his federal authorization to do so. Documents filed with the Indiana Medical Licensing Board and the Attorney General's Office of Indiana also allege that Hackett failed to perform adequate medical examinations or diagnostic procedures before giving wrestlers controlled substance prescriptions and refills, failed to document medical need for prescribing drugs to wrestlers, continued to prescribe controlled substances to one pro wrestler despite knowing that the patient was illegally distributing them, continued to prescribe the drugs to wrestlers he was aware were addicted to them, provided steroids, including testosterone, to at least 3 pro wrestlers without demonstrating any disease they were being treated for. Writing prescriptions for steroids for anything other than treatment of specific diseases is a felony based on the 1988 law, which Zahorian was the government's test case. Hackett's medical license was temporarily suspended for the first time in 1997, and he was later placed on indefinite probation in connection with a 1996 incident with a female patient. According to the Star/News, after she became distraught over problems in her marriage, Hackett grabbed her in a bear hug and kissed her, the board concluded. He also had sex with her on the floor of his office on 2 occasions, the board found. As terms of his probation, Hackett was barred for examining any female patients without another adult present unless those patients agreed in writing that they were willing to be left alone with him. The Attorney General's office in documents filed this week claim Hackett has since violated those conditions. WWF officials first became aware of Hackett 3 or 4 years ago when one of its top wrestlers at the time tested positive for steroids and claimed he shouldn't be suspended because he brought in a prescription from Hackett. This was shortly after McMahon's trial and the WWF was actively testing its wrestlers for illegal drugs. The company was sensitive about the subject at the time. Prescription in hand or not, it was a felony both for a doctor to write prescriptions for steroids without just medical cause, as well as a felony for possession and usage of the drugs for such purposes. Over the next year, Hackett's name came up repeatedly with several WWF wrestlers who were suffering the effects of use of prescription pain pills or showing high levels of such use. Somas in particular had become a major problem, which the company couldn't control with its testing procedures because the wrestlers had legal prescriptions for the drugs. This became even more alarming when Louis Mucciolo overdosed for the first time in 1996 while wrestling for the WWF and nearly died prior to his 1998 death while working for WCW. Spicoli's death, from a heart attack from an enlarged heart after mixing 26 somas, roughly his average daily dosage of the drug according to friends and many times over the recommended daily dosage, prescribed by Hackett, and mixing it with a lot of wine according to a friend who was there. In what was on paper a weak major show lineup, New Japan set the all-time outdoor attendance record for Tokyo on August 28 by selling out Jingu Stadium for the Battle of last summer, headlined by the Great Muta vs. Great Nita explosive barbed wire dream match. The announced crowd of 48,000 came for a show that was described as disappointing to the regular fans but probably satisfying to the casual fans who came to see what would almost surely be both the first and the last explosive match between two legends, even if the match itself was a disappointment. The former outdoor wrestling record for Tokyo was set in the same building for a sellout of 46,187 on December 5, 1993, headlined by the first Nobuhiko Takada vs. Vader Battle of Champions with the UWFI World Champion tapping out the WCW World Champion. Previous to that, the largest outdoor wrestling crowd in Tokyo was approximately 30,000 fans on October 7, 1957 at the old Korakuen Baseball Stadium for the now legendary Rikitozen vs. Luthas match. Tickets were not selling at a fast pace, and a lot of the luster of the card was taken away when Takada pulled out of his announced match against Kensuke Sasaki, which was the second biggest draw on the show. It was said that New Japan officials the day before the show were praying for sunny weather to help the walk-up. As it was, the weather was cloudy and the building ended up packed anyway. It didn't rain but was threatening, and the show was somewhat rushed, lasting approximately 3.5 hours, to get the barbed wire match in before it started raining. The main event along with the 2 junior heavyweight title matches aired on television at 2 a.m. that evening for a 70-minute show. The first ever singles match between New Japan's current world champion and the originator of the gimmick and the ultimate gimmick, in a gimmick totally copied from the success of the Great Muta, actually Keiji Muto's US-created gimmick when he worked as a full-timer in WCW in 1989. Gimmick in Great Nita was thought to be a strong draw. The question was if fans would attend in mass numbers a Tokyo area big show not at the Tokyo Dome, and the lack of a strong undercard made it more questionable. 1. Kazuyuki Fujita beat Brian Johnston in 3:55 with an armbar submission. This match was rushed and the result was an upset, and probably says something for the company's current feelings on Johnston. 2. Shinjiro Otani and Tatsuhiro Takaiwa retained the IWGP Junior Heavyweight Tag Team titles, beating Jushin Liger, Keiichi Yamada, and El Samurai Osamu Matsuda in 15 minutes when Otani pinned Liger after the Spider Bomb spinning power bomb. This was said to be about what one would expect. A very good match, maybe the best on the show, but not off the charts. 3. Kendo Kashin Okamitsu Ishizawa won his first pro singles championship, beating Koji Kanemoto to capture the IWGP Junior title in 14:49 with a flying armbar submission. This result was something of an upset since Kashin had already beaten Kanemoto in June to win the Super Juniors tournament, which set this title match up. This was also said to have been a very good match. 4. Hiroyoshi Tenzan, Kim Kill-choi, and Satoshi Kojima beat Shiro Koshinaka and Tatsumi Fujinami in 8:38 when Tenzan pinned Koshinaka after a spinning heel kick. Said to be disappointing. 5. Manabu Nakanishi and Yuji Nagata capture the IWGP Tag Team titles, beating Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto in 16:01. Nakanishi is now being nicknamed the Summer Man for his G1 tournament win. He followed up the momentum trying to make him into a superstar, and it won't be easy because he doesn't have it at all, and if they pull it off, it's a credit to the company's ability to create a star, with a tag title win to build him up for a singles title match. At the finish, Nakanishi had Goto up in the torture rack while Nagata pinned Ohara after a back suplex. Reports are that Nagata looked good, but he was the only one of the four who did in this match. 6. In a battle to determine a future challenger for Muto's IWGP Heavyweight title, Don Frye pinned Scott Norton in 7:53. This match was said to be surprisingly good. There were a lot of problems potentially going in because Norton was going to be asked to put Frye over, which would basically finalize the reality that Frye had passed Norton for the top foreigner spot in the company. As it was, they had to work out an American finish, which seemed to work live, to get the result they wanted. Both men traded punches and headbutts until ref Masao Hattori was bumped. Norton put Frye down with a power bomb, but there was no ref to count. As Norton was helping Hattori up, Frye got up and hit Norton from behind with a low blow. Norton went down and Frye got the mount position on him and was pounding away with punches, and then got a choke. Hattori got up and saw Norton caught in the choke and stopped the match. Before the next match, Sasaki climbed into the ring and apologized to the fans for the match with Takada not taking place. 7. Masahiro Chono beat Shinya Hashimoto via ref stoppage in 15:45. This result has to be considered a big surprise based on previous patterns, which shows New Japan doing a new booking style. However, this may not have been the time to do it. Chono already beat Hashimoto in the G1 tournament, and Hashimoto was coming off a 2-3 record at G1. Hashimoto is leading into a probable October 11th Tokyo Dome main event against Naoya Ogawa, which would be the biggest match of 1999 in Japan. For Hashimoto to go into that match with so many losses and no big wins takes some of the luster away from the match, but apparently New Japan must believe the angle in January was so strong they can sell out even without protecting Hashimoto leading in. They traded their usual moves. Chono got the SDF a first time, but Hashimoto made the ropes. Chono then used a combination SDF with an armlock and Hattori stopped the match. After the match, Don Frye and Akira came into the ring to celebrate with Chono. This was said to have been a good match. 8. Great Muta, Keiji Muto, defeated Great Nita, Asuyo Nita, in 13:32 of a no-rope barbed wire barricade mat electric landmine double hell death match. Nita came out of a casket. Nita brought in a huge machete early. Both men hit the barbed wire and were blown up. After a few more explosions, Muta got the machete away from Nita and used it on him and scored the pin, thus killing the Nita gimmick. For the second time this year, Toshiaki Kawada suffered an injury that will require him to be out of action for several months. Kawada, 35, who was scheduled to headline the September 4th Budokan Hall show in his first ever match with Vader, will be undergoing eye surgery to repair broken bones around his eye and isn't expected back until the tag team tournament in December. Kawada has previously missed 3 months earlier this year after suffering a broken forearm in his Triple Crown title win over Mitsuharu Misawa in late January, which due to the injury he had to forfeit several days later. He returned May 2nd for the Tokyo Dome match with Hase Hiroshi. The Kawada vs. Vader first singles meeting is apparently jinxed, since All Japan had scheduled it as the main event for the February Budokan Hall show as well. Kawada had apparently been suffering from some double vision dating back to July. Because of the double vision, his normally precisely placed kicks had been hitting foes often in bad places, much to their dismay. On August 23rd in Shizuoka, he cracked heads with one of his opponents, not sure who, in a 6-man tag match, and apparently the condition worsened and has been out of action since. Since All Japan is already lacking depth when it comes to headliners, in order to save the Budokan show, Misawa will wrestle twice, both his regularly scheduled first ever singles meeting with Yoshihiro Takayama, and then he'll return in the main event for a non-title match with Vader. Because All Japan isn't running any shows for 5 weeks after September 4th, Kawada at this point is actually only expected to miss one tour. There is talk of putting Misawa and Akira Taue together in some tag team matches for something new during his absence. In a story that made a lot of mainstream news over the past week that pretty well directly stems from pro wrestling, Jesse Ventura has been complaining about his treatment in the St. Paul Pioneer Press. Ventura claimed he would cancel all the subscriptions to the newspaper going to the Capitol building due to an article on his participation in SummerSlam, which was critical of characters like Mr. Ass, and Ventura's own use of questionable language during his stint as the referee of the main event. The article said that Ventura was participating in a porn-like world and showing bad judgment as governor for doing so. Ventura went on the offensive, noting that the newspaper itself carries ads for businesses dealing with porn and even nicknamed the paper the St. Paul Porn Press in one of his numerous regular radio interviews. Others have suggested Ventura used that article because of the word porn being used as a handy target, since the groups the paper took ads from are clearly far more pornographic than anything that took place at SummerSlam. And he was more mad because of an article that appeared the previous day, the first time in the local mainstream media where it came out as changes in public views and statements regarding the pro wrestling industry both before and after making this lucrative one-night deal. The story was covered as a major news story all week long, particularly on CNN and Fox News Channel. Bernard Shaw on CNN on August 30th was interviewing the publisher of the newspaper, who made several snide remarks about Ventura which shocked Shaw, in particular alluding to the fact Ventura would know more about these porn business advertised in the paper business than he would, and talked about the governor as being thin-skinned, something Shaw and the national media really aren't aware of but the Minnesota media is well aware of. His defense of his paper, saying the editorial and advertising departments stay clear of each other and saying they accept ads from all legal businesses so long as they meet the criteria due to the First Amendment, did come across as weak. He also said that Ventura that afternoon had told the AP that he was only joking since it was noted that none of the subscriptions to the newspaper had actually been cancelled. Amidst the plethora of mainline news coverage of pro wrestling came a piece on ABC's Nightline on August 27 concerning hardcore wrestling. It was quite a sight to see no-name indie wrestlers doing really bad chair shots in front of around 100 people treated as a serious news subject. The idea that when a show the caliber of Nightline investigates pro wrestling, hardcore style in particular, and its effect on children, they go to Mantua, New Jersey for basically unknown Combat Zone Wrestling, and interview the promoter of the almost as unknown Bayonne, New Jersey-based Jersey All-Pro Wrestling, is mind-boggling. But there it was, Ted Koppel, one of the most respected television newsmen in the country, debating an overmatched Jeff Shapiro, the promoter of the Bayonne, New Jersey-based group. The show opened with Nightline reporter Dave Marish going to a Combat Zone show in a warehouse with about 100 or so fans. They interviewed fans, who did great service to wrestling fans around the country by saying they were there with the blood. They showed clips of some really bad wrestling, even by any standards, featuring terrible chair shots and a guy jumping off a pretty high balcony onto an opponent and sending him through a table while, in ECW fashion, the crowd started chanting CZW. They brought a psychologist to the matches, who found them very exciting and entertaining, but focused on how riled up very young children attending the shows, one of whom brought a barbed wire baseball bat to be used as a weapon, and apparently, with the ABC TV cameras there, was disappointed because none of the wrestlers would use it. Were from the simulated brutal activity. The psychologist, in what was obviously a dated reference, said that recent studies with kids revealed Hulk Hogan as the 7th biggest sports hero among young children. John Zandig, the promoter of the show, bragged that it was his promotion that introduced the new spot of using a staple gun to the head, that has since been taken national by ECW. Koppel then interviewed Shapiro, who heads another organization that does hardcore-style matches but also called it family entertainment. Koppel, who was rolling his eyes that people would produce something like this as entertainment and aim it at young children, particularly when Shapiro claimed the bulk of his audience is between the ages of 10 and 16, said he didn't care if adults attended these events but was concerned at parents for allowing their children to attend and promoters for presenting these type of shows. Shapiro, who claimed his shows were appropriate for children, was made to look really bad by Koppel. Koppel did note he thought it was the parents' responsibility more than that of wrestling promoters for young children attending violent shows. My thoughts when it was over was just how ridiculously insignificant this story appeared to be, and to have Nightline treated as a major issue was amazing. Not that the effects of pro wrestling on children, which with a number of kids that watch, isn't a real news story worthy of the show. It is. But that they focused on promoters and companies that aren't even a blip on the pro wrestling radar map. When Nightline does pro wrestling and its effect on kids, if it investigates anything but WWF and WCW, who have the largest kids audiences, or perhaps throwing in ECW to demonstrate where wrestling sometimes can go when it comes to violence, it is missing the entire story. Japanese television rundown. August 1st Pancrase. This was a combination afternoon/evening show at Korakuen Hall for the Neo Blood Newcomers tournament. The tournament was generally considered a big success for the company since both shows sold out, even though Korakuen Hall is a relatively small building. A Pancrase wrestler, Ikuizumi Noah, came out on top in the end, plus a charismatic newcomer debuted in Genki Sudo, a protege of Boss Rutan's, who has been training out of Beverly Hills, California. 1. Takafumi Ito drew Chris Lytle after 10 minutes regulation and 3 minutes overtime in a non-tourney match. A combination of mat work and hard slaps. Pretty decent bout. Nobody had a serious advantage in the overtime, so there was really no decision fair other than a draw. 2. Yuki Kondo beat Jason Godzi in 5:08 in a non-tournament match. This was an important bout for Cop champ Kondo, since a few years back, at another point he held the title, but in a non-title bout, he was physically dominated throughout and tapped out by unheralded Godzi. Godzi, who is scheduled for the next UFC pay-per-view show, showed up really soft around the middle. Godzi bled early, but was on top slapping away. Godzi was really mad when the ref ordered a stand-up, taking away his advantage position although he wasn't trying to work for a submission. Godzi mounted him again but again couldn't do any damage. After a scramble, Godzi caught Kondo in a front headlock, but when Kondo broke it, he wound up on top and grabbed an ankle lock for the submission. Because the crowd favorite came from behind to win, the fans liked this. 3. In the first round of the tournament, Daisuke Watanabe won a unanimous decision over 10 minutes, beating debuting Masatomo Iba. It had its flurries. 4. Minowa beat Dayu Takase in 7:59 in a first-round match. Takase's head was taped up since he'd suffered a pretty brutal beating in UFC from Jeremy Horn 2 weeks earlier, and it was kind of quick for him to be back. Minowa dominated, throwing slaps from the top while in the guard. Takase got the top, but Minowa got the submission with a triangle choke. 5. Sudo won a unanimous decision over Kosei Kubota in a really hot match. Sudo, who is 164 pounds, has super charisma and clearly was a pro wrestling fan growing up, as he's learned shooting but can combine it with working a crowd. He made a tremendous debut beating an experienced bigger fighter. Sudo is also fun to watch because he's a go-for-broke type fighter, always trying to make things happen, even if it costs him. Kubota was clearly more skilled here, but Sudo's energy level and unusual quickness kept it close. Kubota was on top, but Sudo would slap him hard from the bottom. Sudo was going out there so hard that he got tired, but still kept slapping away. Kubota got tired and both were slapping out, with Kubota getting a bloody nose. The first 10 minutes were excellent and the crowd popped big when it was ruled a draw, meaning they could get 3 minutes more. Fans were totally into Sudo by this point, who landed on top in the guard, then got a mount. Kubota escaped, but Sudo got his back. Both guys were exhausted. Sudo had a positioning advantage during overtime and got the unanimous decision. Sudo tried to jump up in the air and spread his legs a la Boss Rutan celebrating the win, but it was more a spoof of it meant as comedy. 6. Minoru Toyonaga, a non-pancrase fighter, who had Kazushi Sakuraba in his corner, beat Daisuke Ishii via split decision after 10 minutes regulation and 3 minutes overtime. Another really good match. Toyonaga was on top slapping around, but he got caught as well and his nose exploded with bloody everywhere, not only on him, but all over Ishii as well. Toyonaga had more advantage time, but I guess the sheer quantity of blood ruled it a draw at regulation. In overtime, Toyonaga was tagging him standing but still was bleeding all over the place. The crowd was really into this one. Toyonaga got a split decision. How one judge could vote for Ishii, even considering the blood, is beyond me. 7. Minowa beat Watanabe in a semifinal match in 4:28 with a triangle choke. Minowa controlled the match. 8. Toyonaga beat Sudo in the other semifinal. Both men had a lot taken out of them in their first round wars, but the crowd really liked this one. Toyonaga's nose continued to bleed throughout the match. It was ruled a draw after 10 minutes regulation and they went into overtime. Sudo was trying everything, but Toyonaga nearly got one submission and landed on top when Sudo tried a takedown. Since Sudo didn't do anything in the overtime, Toyonaga had to win the decision. Sudo was then supposed to wrestle Watanabe in the consolation match, but he injured his eye and the doctor wouldn't allow him to come back for another match. 9. Jason DeLucia beat Manabu Yamada via decision after 15 minutes in a non-tournament match. DeLucia dominated most of the match, including nearly getting a choke. Yamada, who also suffered a bloody nose, nearly got an ankle lock toward the end. The decision was pretty one-sided. 10. Leon Dake beat Ryushi Yanagisawa via ref stoppage at 12:48 in a non-tournament match. They were standing and trading early until it went to the ground. Dake threw some good body shots and head slaps from the top and busted Yanagisawa up. Eventually Yanagisawa suffered a bad cut over the left eye, to the point the eyelid was only hanging like a threat and they had no choice but to stop the match. 11. Minowa beat Toyonaga to win the tournament in 2:57. Minowa was far fresher, having already won twice via submission while Toyonaga went the distance twice. Minowa got a choke right away, but Toyonaga was close enough to the ropes. He got a second choke in the middle to win. Minowa did the Steve Austin celebration, except he climbed to the top rope instead of the middle ropes to raise his arms in all four corners, and nearly fell off at one point. August 15, New Japan. This was the first live television show for New Japan in 7 years as the G1 tournament final. After seeing it, it was a major letdown. The wrestlers were all burned out physically by having to do 5 nights of hard matches. Keiji Muto's knees were shot and he had to carry the show wrestling 3 times in one night. The show was to create a new superstar in Manabu Nakanishi, and they couldn't have done it better from a booking standpoint. The crowd responded real big after the championship win, but it was more of a response combining the attitude of he just won something big so we have to respond as opposed to the real long emotional response. The problem is that Nakanishi just doesn't have it and the people know it, even though they are into the fantasy of who wins being important enough to where they'll react to him, just not that fervent emotional getting behind the rising star deal. New Japan and WCW are so opposite in that New Japan knows it has to create new stars even though the existing stars are in their mid-30s, but doesn't have the stars ready to be at the top so simply took a guy not ready and pushed him anyway since they had to push someone. WCW has guys ready and simply blocks them from advancement and has paid the price for it. I thought the show by G1 standards was a huge disappointment. It was easily the worst finals in history, and the matches couldn't even compare with the first 2 nights of the tournament in Osaka. 1. Hiroyoshi Tenzan pinned Masahiro Chono in 1726. This was good, particularly toward the finish where Tenzan got one near fall after another. Tenzan bled a little. He used a mountain bomb off the top rope for a near fall, then got several more near falls including his diving headbutt. Tenzan used Chono's own low blow kick on him and came off with a combination fist drop and diving headbutt for the pin. 3 1/4 stars. 2. Muto beat Satoshi Kojima in 11:40. Like their IWGP title match, this was a disappointment. Muto was walking very gingerly just coming out and Kojima was having a sloppy match. Muto carried it with drop kicks to the knee and dragon screws. Kojima's big comeback consisted of 3 lariats, the first 2 of which were sloppy. Muto came back with more drop kicks to the knee and a dragon screw off the ropes, setting up more of the same and finishing with the figure 4. Kojima was crawling to the ropes and his hand was almost there when he tapped, which made for a good finish. Muto's ability to carry a match while being physically limited was really evident here. 2.5 stars. 3. Nakanishi beat Shinya Hashimoto in 15:22. Nakanishi was really bad, both on offense, in his goofy comebacks and goofy selling. Hashimoto did a good one-man show in carrying it but he wasn't a miracle worker. It was pretty bad early, but picked up with Hashimoto making his comeback with the hard kicks and chops. Hashimoto hit 2 DDTs and Nakanishi got right back up from them like Superman, but then stayed down after an implant DDT. Hashimoto was doing a judo hip toss into an armbar but they messed up the hip toss part of it. Hashimoto did an Enzui Jiri and seemed on the verge of a win when Nakanishi speared his bad right knee. Nakanishi delivered headbutt after headbutt to the knee before Nakanishi bent the knee over his own neck like you'd do a strongman bending an iron bar stunt with it, which they called an Argentinian knee breaker, since the torture rack in Japan is the Argentinian backbreaker, and Hashimoto submitted. Hashimoto raised Nakanishi's arm in victory after the match. 2.5 stars. 4. Muto beat Yuji Nagata in 10:28. It was mostly on the ground. The mat work was very good but you could see Muto having to save himself to carry Nakanishi for a long final, and that also limited Nagata in what he could do. It was the same dragon screws and dropkicks to the knee. The big spot was Muto going for a figure 4 and Nagata trapping him in a triangle. Since Muto beat Nagata earlier in the tournament, some fans were thinking this had a good shot at the upset. At the finish, Muto hit the Jinsei Shinzaki backwards dropkick before another dragon screw and figure 4 for the submission. 2 3/4 stars. 5. Nakanishi beat Muto in 14:43 to win the tournament. The fans were really into this more for the prestige and history of G1 than anything special in the match. Nakanishi racked Muto the first time at 6 minutes but Muto escaped. Muto carried it on offense but again Nakanishi didn't look good. Nakanishi got the rack a second time but Muto flipped out of it and delivered a dragon screw and did his first moonsault of the tournament, I guess figuring with this as his last match for weeks, there was nothing to save his knees for. Nakanishi came back spearing the knee and got a near fall with a German suplex. Super heat at this point. Muto had a long figure 4 spot before Nakanishi made the ropes. After another dragon screw, Muto tried the move one more time. Nakanishi got underneath him and put him up in the rack for the submission. The crowd popped pretty big and chanted his name since it was a big deal, but the emotion died down quicker than it should have. The celebration made it seem like a big deal but compared with past years, a lot was missing. 3.25 stars. Television ratings rundown. The latest update on all WWF and WCW performers that have appeared as a main focal point of a competitive segment at least 10 times in 1999. A competitive segment consists of a competitive quarter-hour or total run-in period after 9:15 p.m. on Monday nights when both shows are on simultaneously. Ranked by quarter-hour percentage increase or decrease. A plus 1.00 average rating means that on average, when this performer is featured on a segment, the audience increases by 0.1 ratings points, which today would be about 75,950 homes or about 113,900 viewers. Updated as of August 23rd. The May 24th television show, due to the unique circumstances, are not included in the averages. Because August 30th and September 6th aren't competitive shows, they will not be included in these percentages. Mexico. Rey Mysterio beat Psicosis before a nearly sold-out crowd of 5,500 on August 26 in Tijuana in their hair versus mask, teacher versus student match. The show was billed as El Evento del Siglo, the show of the century, with heavily jacked-up ticket prices. The bout was good, with incredible heat throughout, particularly at the finish. Quality-wise, it was good but not off the charts, and maybe even a slight disappointment since it was the match Psicosis was losing his mask in, and he's had so many classic singles matches in that city over the years. Psicosis had Juventud Guerrera in his corner, and Mysterio at first had Halloween, Cyclope in WCW, in his corner. The crowd seemed split 50-50 as far as who they favor, since Mysterio is the local wrestling legend, but Psicosis has been the hottest wrestler in Tijuana for the past year. Psicosis won the first fall in 2 minutes with an Arabian facebuster after breaking a guitar over his head. Halloween tripped Psicosis, establishing Psicosis as the face when Mysterio hit him with a chair. Rey Mysterio Jr. then came out and chased Halloween to the back, helping Psicosis. This brought Damien out as Mysterio's second. Mysterio won the second fall in 5 minutes after a power bomb through a table. Even at this point there were huge chants for both Mysterio and Psicosis. Psicosis took an unreal bump out of the ring. Finally, after a ref bump and a double knockout spot, Guerrera turned on Psicosis, which resulted in this immediate mega heat reaction that you just don't see anymore at pro wrestling. Guerrera held Psicosis and Mysterio went for a low kick, but Psicosis moved and Mysterio kicked Guerrera low. Damien then interfered, bring Mysterio Jr. back, and he did a running flip dive out of the ring, followed by Psicosis doing this insane plancha where he flew like Rob Van Dam and actually overshot his target. With Psicosis distracted by Damien, Mysterio came from behind with a German suplex for the pin at 7 minutes of the third fall. 15:47 total match time. Psicosis unmasked, and since he's got a cool look, the crowd went crazy when the mask came off and he revealed his name as Dionisio Castellanos of Tijuana, and the crowd did a prolonged Psicosis chant after the match. The semifinal was even better, with Fuerza and Juventud Guerrera teaming up for the first time in Tijuana in years, along with Dr. Wagner Jr. beating Mysterio Jr. and Negro Casas and Emilio Charles Jr. Mysterio Jr. vs. Guerrera stole the show and were awesome. Finish saw Fuerza kick Mysterio Jr. low and Juventud pinned him in 21:01. Not much to speak of regarding the undercard. Want to make a quick thanks to Ron Rivera for getting me the tape of this show immediately after it concluded. As mentioned last week, Psicosis losing his mask in Tijuana is a prelude to his shortly taking off his mask in WCW. EMLL announced its 66th anniversary show at Arena Mexico will be on September 24th. Originally it was going to be on September 17th, however AAA earlier in the week announced, thinking the EMLL show would be on that day, its own biggest show of the year on September 17th at nearby Juan de la Barrera Gym, headlined by Pero Aguayo's last match ever in the Distrito Federal and a mask vs. mask match with Octagon vs. Shockmate. To avoid confusion, EMLL will run September 17th, but its big show will be moved a week back. The reason the posters were taken down in Tijuana for the Rey Mysterio vs. Psicosis match was because the printer made a mistake and printed it was Rey Jr. and not Rey Sr. in the main event, and they were distributed all over the city, and when the mistake was realized, were all taken down. With no posters up due to the snafu, that's probably why the building, while basically sold out, wasn't overflowing as one would expect. There was a lot of mainstream sports coverage leading up to the match, however, so readers of the newspapers would have been almost inundated with pub. There was a story basically hinting without outright saying that Psicosis would lose, blaming it on WCW's not caring about Mexican tradition that dates back to the Maya Indians and its overall treatment of Mexicans, almost joking how a company could be so screwed up as to not see the talent in people like La Parka and Silver King. August 27th at Arena Mexico saw the return to the ring of Rayo de Jalisco Jr., which drew a larger than usual crowd, but his main event where he teamed with the Headhunters to lose in straight falls to Los Hermanos Dinamita when Universo fouled and pinned Rayo. They are probably going to do a mask versus mask match as the main event for the September 24th anniversary show. It was also said Rayo has gotten so fat he looks like a third Headhunter brother. The semi saw Mr. Mexico and Shocker and Villano Tercero beat Atlantis and Lismark and Mr. Niebla with the focus on continuing V3 versus Atlantis. In a huge surprise, on August 15th in Tehuacan, Cadaver de Ultra Tumba won the UWA heavyweight title from Canek. The two are scheduled for a rematch in the same city on September 6th. Ovaciones, the biggest sports newspaper in Mexico, when reporting on the result, ripped on Canek for dropping his title to a wrestler with weight problems and limited ability. I believe Canek has held the title since March of 1994 when he regained it from Yamato, Kim Duke. The belt means virtually nothing in Mexico today, but in the late 70s through the early 90s, it was the top heavyweight belt in the country. Lady Apache beat La Amapola August 27th in Netzahualcoyot to keep the CMLL women's title, which she was to defend on September 1st in Tlalnepantla against La Diabolica. All Japan, after 2 title matches this past week, all of the belts within this promotion are now held by Mitsuharu Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa. Misawa and Ogawa captured all 3 tag team titles, PWF World, Old NWA International and All Asian, from Yoshihiro Takayama and Takao Mori on August 25th in Hiroshima before a sellout 2,300 fans when Misawa pinned Mori after his side piledriver in 23:02, leaving Misawa with 6 belts in all, his half of the 3 sets of tag belts along with the Triple Crown of singles belts. That match was televised on August 29th. Then on August 30th at Hakata Star Lanes before a sellout 2,600, Ogawa retained the PWF Junior title, pinning 2 Cold Scorpio with his figure 4 jackknife in 1831. Misawa and Ogawa are expected to vacate the All-Asian tag titles, since they are traditionally a mid-card belt. Judging from magazine photos, both Gladiator and Scorpio came to this tour far lighter and in much better condition than either has been in years. Gladiator probably needed to drop the weight to put less pressure on his recovering knees, while Scorpio had gotten out of shape, at times to the point he used it as a comedy routine in ECW. Both have also gotten good reviews for their work so far this tour. After September 4th Budokan, this group will be off for 5 weeks, with October 9th to October 30th tour featuring Stan Hansen, Gary Albright, Johnny Ace, Mike Burton, Giant Kimalatu, Johnny Smith and Monukia Mossman as foreigners. Interesting to see Vader's name not included on that list, since the original plan was for him to beat Misawa for the Triple Crown on October 30th, which is the last Triple Crown title match until late January. If he's not on the tour, that would be the first All Japan tour he's missed since joining the company, which would also explain why they'd need Hansen, since they'd need a mainstream draw on that side. Gladiator's name is also conspicuous by its absence, but he hasn't made an ECW deal at press time either. Gladiator did pin Jinsei Shinzaki on August 29th in Osaka. Also on August 30th was the first ever singles match with Vader pinning Hasei Hiroshi. With Kawada injured, they set up a main event on September 2nd with Kenta Kobashi and Akira Taue and Shinzaki as a new trio against Vader and Gladiator and Albright. New Japan. The main lineups for the G1 Tag Team Tournament from September 10th to September 23rd were announced. The first night is September 10th in Omiya with Kensuke Sasaki and Kazuyuki Fujita vs Masahiro Chono and Don Frye, Shiro Koshinaka and Junji Hirata vs Keiji Muto and Scott Norton, Takashi Iizuka and Brian Johnston vs Manabu Nakanishi and Yuji Nagata and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Satoshi Kojima vs Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto. September 12th in Hamamatsu is Shinya Hashimoto and Meng vs Tenzan and Kojima, Iizuka and Johnston vs Chono and Frye, Sasaki and Fujita vs Goto and Ohara. September 13th in Niigata is Nakanishi and Nagata vs Chono and Frye, Hashimoto and Meng vs Goto and Ohara, Iizuka and Johnston vs Muto and Norton. September 15th in Kawasaki is Nakanishi and Nagata vs Muto and Norton, Hashimoto and Meng vs Koshinaka and Hirata, Chono and Frye vs Goto and Ohara. Sasaki and Fujita vs Iizuka and Johnston. September 16th in Sendai is Hashimoto and Meng vs Chono and Frye, Muto and Norton vs Tenzan and Kojima, Nakanishi and Nagata vs Goto and Ohara, Koshinaka and Hirata vs Iizuka and Johnston. September 18th in Nagoya Aichi Gym is Hashimoto and Meng vs Muto and Norton, Chono and Frye vs Tenzan and Kojima, Sasaki and Fujita vs Nakanishi and Nagata, Koshinaka and Iizuka vs Goto and Ohara. September 19th in Osaka is Muto and Norton vs Chono and Frye, Hashimoto and Meng vs Sasaki and Fujita, Nakanishi and Nagata vs Tenzan and Kojima, Iizuka and Johnston vs Goto and Ohara. September 21st in Maebashi is Sasaki and Fujita vs Tenzan and Kojima, Muto and Norton vs Goto and Ohara, Koshinaka and Hirata vs Nakanishi and Nagata. The finals are September 23rd at Budokan Hall with the top 2 point-getters meeting. It seems like pretty much an uninspiring tournament, with the intriguing stuff really revolving around the first Fry vs Meng showdown for whatever that means since everything else has been done before. Minoru Tanaka of Battle Arts, who has had several great matches in this group, particularly in the Super Junior tournament and later challenging Koji Kanemoto for the IWGP Junior title, is expected to form a tag team with Kanemoto to face Otani and Takaiwa for the IWGP Junior titles on the October 11th Dome show. Other Japan notes. After all the final wrestling shows at Sapporo Nakajima Sports Center this year, the actual final show took place on August 25th, after a 45-year history. It was the only building from the original 1954 debut of Rikidozan's Pro Wrestling that was still regularly running shows. FMW ran the final show before a crowd announced at 4,900 with the promise that Hayabusa would unmask after his main event match against Mr. Genosuke for the World Brass Knucks title. Hayabusa won with the Falcon Arrow, and they had a ceremony with the 10 count where he'd unmask. But Koto Fuyuki Genosuke and the rest of the heels hit the ring during the ceremony and beat him up with a chain and cut up his mask with scissors. Hayabusa had his ring gear torn off and stood there in nothing but his underwear swearing revenge against Fuyuki and Genosuke. Hayabusa's new ring name will simply be H, and they look to be building for their big show of the year on November 23rd at Yokohama Arena with H vs Genosuke in a rematch and maybe Fuyuki vs Masato Tanaka. Tanaka is only going into ECW for one show since on the next tour he's booked through September 18th, ECW pay-per-view is September 19th, and is booked back on September 23rd. Tanaka will be going to ECW as FMW's Independent World Heavyweight Champion as his final title defense before ECW was a win over Yukihiro Kanemura on August 25th. Also Fuyuki and Koji Nakagawa and Gedo kept the Wu six-man titles beating Tetsuhiro Kuroda and Hisakatsu Oya and Yoshinori Sasaki. Some of the major matches on the next tour include a ladder match on September 16th in Fukui with H and Tanaka and Kuroda and Oya vs Fuyuki and Kanemura and Nakagawa and Mystery Partner, a Wu six-man title match on September 23rd in Kanazawa with Fuyuki and Nakagawa and Gedo defending against Tanaka and Kuroda and Oya. And the September 24th Korakuen Hall main event is H and Kuroda and Sasaki and Flying Kid Ichihara vs Nakagawa and Gedo and two Mystery Partners. Chris Youngblood debuted for FMW this past week. H, real name Eiji Izaki, had his first match without his mask on August 27th in Asahikawa as part of an elimination match where he and Kuroda and Oya and Riki Fuji and Sasaki beat Fuyuki and Genosuke and Kanemura and Jado and Haido 5-2 when Hayabusa pinned Fuyuki to win it. They did an angle at the show where H destroyed Genosuke's knee. I believe Genosuke had a legit injury and will be out of action, and this was done to have an angle cover. Giant Steel, who may be Butch Masters and not Daryl Carolay as reported here last week, we'll know for sure next week when the mags come out. Already did a singles job this week for Tanaka. Big Japan debuted a heel called Black Samples to feud with Mike Samples. I'm presuming Black Samples is Genosuke Kobayashi, since Abdullah Jr. Kobayashi has disappeared from the results. Gia runs a major show on September 15th at Yokohama Bunka Gym with a double main event of Chigusa Nagio vs Linus Asuka and Atsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda vs Mayumi Ozaki and Akira Hokuto. On April 4th, Asuka vs Nagio in their first meeting in 10 years, sold out the building. Stips are if Asuka wins, Nagio must join SSU, Asuka's heel group, and wrestle under the name Zero, that name she worked under for a few weeks in WCW and IWA. Owner Kishu Asano did an angle where he took out a $90,000 loan, putting up his bar and restaurant as collateral, to bring in 55-year-old Tiger Jeet Singh to gain revenge on Tarzan Goto for him. This was the angle for the August 27th Korakuen Hall show where they main evented with a no-time limit street fight where the losing manager had to strip in the middle of the ring with Asano as one corner and female valet Maya in the other corner. Singh and Shoji Nakamaki and Yoshia Yamashita won the main event over Goto and Mr. Pogo and Toryu in 15:22 when Singh pinned Toryu. Asano blew the green kabuki mist in Toryu's face, claiming to have been taught by Kabuki, and then Singh put the Cobra Claw on for the finish. Maya then stripped to stripper music, but before she was naked a towel was put over her. Maya then challenged Asano to a match on September 7th at Tokyo Komazawa Olympic Park Gym where the losing manager gets blown up, which apparently will lead to a big outdoor show on October 24th probably with Goto vs Sting in an explosive barbed wire match. After doing a very successful event on August 22nd at Ariake Rainbow Stage, Atsushi Onita has booked 3 more shows on his own on September 18th in Yokkaichi, September 19th in Nagoya and September 29th at Korakuen Hall. Like last Sunday when there were so many shows in Tokyo on one day, on August 29th there were 4 shows in Osaka, but none drew particularly well. All Japan drew 1,500, Osaka Pro Wrestling drew its usual 350, and they did afternoon and evening shows at the small IMP Hall with Garia and Oz Academy, largely with the same wrestlers, drawing 850 and 800 respectively. The Gia show saw Akira Hokuto and Asia Kong beat Toshio Yamada and Meiko Satomura, and Mita and Shimoda beat Chigusa Nagio and Kaoru in a main event that only went 8 seconds. For Oz Academy, Ozaki pinned Hokuto with the Tequila Sunrise. Years before, when Ozaki was a top star for JWP and Hokuto was the top for AJW and they did an interpromotional singles match, Hokuto wouldn't even sell and let Ozaki look credible against her in a match because Hokuto believed Ozaki wasn't in her league, which at the time she wasn't, and Linus Asuka and Mita and Shimoda beat Ozaki and Kong and Sugar Sato. Battle Arts finished its Young Generation Singles Tournament, which has been going on for the past month with afternoon and evening shows at Tokyo FM Hall on August 29th. Yuki Ishikawa finished the round robin as the high point getter with 10 points after beating Karl Malenko. Alexander Otsuka lost his shot at going to the finals, being upset by Takeshi Ono. In a match where the winner would get to the finals, Daisuke Ikeda beat Minoru Tanaka and then Muhammad Yone beat Malenko, so Yone and Ikeda finished with 9 points. At the evening show, Ikeda wrestled more than 35 minutes, first beating Yone, and then beating Ishikawa in 1959 to win the tournament. For the joint Battle Arts/Michinoku Pro Show on October 17th in Yokohama Bunka Gym, they are doing a fan balloting to pick who they want Great Sasuke and Ishikawa to face as a tag team in the main event. At this point the leading team is Taka Michinoku and Shoichi Funaki. The first ever father-daughter tag team in Japan took place on August 29th at the Michinoku Pro Show in Maebashi before 1,500 fans, with Gran Hamada teaming with daughter Ayako to beat Masaaki Mochizuki and Mikiko Futagami. Mochizuki delivered some very stiff kicks to Ayako in the stomach. After the match, Hamada said that he'd like to go back to Mexico and team with Ayako and his other daughter Shochito in a trios match. Curry man on the recently completed Michinoku tour was Christopher Daniels. Antonio Inoki and Naoya Ogawa were in China this past week, supposedly trying to set up running a big show in that country for later this year. Satoru Sayama's Seikendo promotion invited Victor Quiñones, who has been in Japan of late attempting to negotiate deals for both WWF and ECW, including the Masato Tanaka deal for the ECW pay-per-view, and Bruce Pritchard to their October 3rd show at the Ariake Coliseum. There have been talks about after the 2000 Olympics, both Seikendo and WWF working together to sign Alexander Karelin to work as a pro wrestler, although at this point even talking about it seems premature, but it has come out in Japan. Mitsuya Nagai, who formerly worked with Rings and most recently with K1, along with Hansa Nyman, also formerly with Rings, are joining Seikendo. Shinobu Kondori of LLPW is out of action with a concussion which they say she suffered in her August 22nd LLPW title loss to Harley Saito. Tsuyoshi Kosaka of Rings is out of action with a neck injury suffered on the August 19th show in the Gilbert Yvel match. As best we can tell, and this is judging from photos, the match appeared to be a shoot. We should have the tape in a week or so because there was major intensity in the photos that usually isn't there in worked matches. Again, it's probably unfair to judge from photos. Kosaka scored the only point with an ankle lock. Kosaka went for a judo throw and both tumbled through the ropes to the floor where Kosaka hurt his neck and couldn't continue at age 17. They awarded the match to Kosaka since he was ahead at the time of the injury. Also from mag photos of the Linus Asuka vs Kyoko Inoue 60-minute straw, they showed a spot where Asuka came off the balcony at Kawasaki City Gym, approximately 10 feet high, with a double foot stomp onto Inoue, who was covered with a table. Here and there, we want to wish our sympathies to longtime friend and writer Alex Merves on the recent passing away of his father. The NWA 51st anniversary show on September 25th in Charlotte will be headlined by Naoya Ogawa vs Gary Steele for the NWA title. Dan Severn pulled out of the show because he's being inducted into a martial arts Hall of Fame in Houston that weekend. There will be a 6-team elimination tournament with teams from various parts of the country, the winners facing the NWA Tag Champs, Dukes Dalton and Knuckles Nelson. Oh, you didn't know? For the belts later that evening, a Queen's Cup match with Easy Rider from Canada versus Sebastian P. Sterling from the UK, a national title match with Doug Gilbert defending against Don Brody, A North American title match with Colorado Kid vs. Jerry Lawler and a junior heavyweight Royal Rumble with the winner facing Logan Kane for the title. Oziel Toscano, who wrestled in WWF as Armando Fernandez and EMLL as Tarzan Boy, will be the biggest name in that Rumble. There is yet another pay-per-view scheduled called Heroes of Wrestling on October 10th from Casino Magic in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, the site of 2 UFC events, featuring George Steele, Jake Roberts, Jim Neidhart, King Kong Bundy, Bushwhackers, Sensational Sherry, Greg Valentine, Marty Jannetty, Tully Blanchard, Stan Lane, Nikolai Volkov, Lou Albano, Jimmy Snuka, Bob Orton, Tommy Rogers, Yokozuna, Samu, and Fatu. The Contra Costa California Times has a column on August 25th about the incredibly strange wrestling show on August 20th in San Francisco. The story wasn't even negative. The Los Angeles Times on August 29th in the gossip column The Biz talked about Imagine Entertainment's Beyond the Mat wrestling movie, which was praised by Imagine partner Brian Grazer. Grazer said the movie, which features the directorial debut of Barry Blaustein, a longtime fan and former staff writer on Saturday Night Live who helped create Eddie Murphy's Buckwheat and Gumby characters and also co-wrote Nutty Professor, was done because Blaustein had accrued enough goodwill with the company and was passionate about the subject matter. The company backed the project for the relationship with an artist we value. The movie is planned for a 1-week Oscar qualifying run in Los Angeles in the fall. Pero Aguayo's final career matches in the United States are said to be September 4th in Compton and September 5th in Anaheim as part of double main events. Aguayo and Tarzan Boy and El Colo vs. Blue Panther and Apollo Dantes and Muldad headline plus a mask vs. hair match with El Hijo del Santo vs. Misterioso. I wonder who is going to win that one? For Power Pro on August 28th, they announced Doug Gilbert was injured, actually on tour of Japan, by Mike Tierney and Glenn Kolka. Jay Jalette is the latest wrestler from New England to arrive, joining Steve Bradley and Alex Arion. They aired an angle from Blytheville, Arkansas where Jim Cornette and Bradley jumped Kurt Angle and tried to put him in a freezer, but Brandon Baxter made the save with a fire extinguisher. Should mention that Angle is looking really impressive in the ring, and not just because he's working with Bradley, who is reminiscent of Rob Van Dam from about 3 years ago, and that he's a great athlete but still doesn't have his timing of when to do his moves down. If this was the 70s or the 80s, Angle with his look, background and ability in the ring would be a sure headliner already. This being the 90s, his somewhat bland interviews and the fact his style is based on wrestling are going to hold him back, but he'd be almost a sure superstar if given an initial push in Japan. The rest of the WWF developmental talent, Tierney looks bad, Kolka has a good look and charisma, so he looks to have some potential, and Vic Grimes has the same weaknesses he had 1 year ago, largely his wrestling inside the ring and his weight problem. They set up a marathon match with Bradley vs. Angle, which Bradley won 3-2. Grimes turned face asking to join Cornette's heel group, but Cornette turned him down and told him to waddle off. Later, when Kolka, Tierney and Cornette were beating up on Wolfie D, Grimes made the save. Former WCW announcer Lee Marshall was seen this past week on ESPN2 broadcasting an arm wrestling show. Nicole Bass is working for the Lunatic Wrestling Federation on September 18th in Lamont, Illinois. For more info, call 847-604 and 929. Speaking of Jerry Lawler, he did an indie show in Colorado Springs, Colorado on August 28th against Colorado Kid, which drew about 150 fans. Lawler joked during the match that back home in Memphis, more people than that watch him wash his car. The August 30th Seattle Times had a story on Washington State University hiring Lawrence DeGarris, longtime East Coast indie wrestler Professor Larry Briscoe, and you can imagine who his favorite wrestler growing up must have been, to teach sports management. DeGarris, 34, has been wrestling for 13 years. DeGarris earned his doctorate in sports sociology from the University of Connecticut in 1997, and this is his first teaching professorship. Jersey All Pro Wrestling had its second anniversary show on August 29th at the Crowne Plaza at the Meadowlands. It included an all-day autograph show featuring Randy Savage and Gorgeous George and the original Four Horsemen, Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard, Ole Anderson and J.J. Dillon. The big stars were said to be not a financial success, although promoters are looking to do Four Horsemen autograph signing sessions in the Carolinas where they have far more history than the New York metro area, where they really didn't appear very often. Savage and George signed only about 100 autographs at $20 apiece, not good since they were reportedly paid $7,000 and $3,000 respectively. The Horsemen signed about 150 autographs and the group package for all five was said to be $30,000. Fans noted the obvious heat among the members of the Horsemen. Ole Anderson refused to even shake Flair's hand and there was heat with Blanchard as well. There were about 350 fans attending the wrestling show, which included ECW wrestlers New Jack, Jazz, Jason, and Dawn Marie. There were apparently some political problems since WCW was going to pull its people if the ECW people were advertised as being part of the same deal, so the ECW wrestlers were not advertised. Empire Wrestling Federation September 12 in San Bernardino, California, September 18 in Chino, California at Don Lugo High School. The latter show headlined by Honky Tonk Man and 10.9 at San Bernardino High headlined by Tony Atlas. Frontier Wrestling Alliance at the Knights nightclub in Kidderminster, England is headlined by Reckless Youth from the US facing Jody Fleisch, who recently finished a Michinoku tour as Doc Chan. Howard Brody of the NWA was trying to recruit Franz Schumann's WWA promotion in Germany and Austria to join. Independent Wrestling Federation on October 9 in Nutley, New Jersey at the Parks and Rec Building and October 23 in South Plainfield, New Jersey at Grand Slam USA with the latter show headlined by Nova and Chris Chetty vs. Steve Corino and Danny During. Some more European news. New Japan's Yutaka Yoshi is coming into work only in Germany, not in Austria. Catch as Catch Can, CCC instead of CWA will be promoting the traditional Hanover, Germany tournament from September 2 to October 31 and will include the comeback of Miles Zerno, a big star in the 70s. The year-end tournament in Bremen, Germany will be only from November 25 to December 4, which is the only tournament Otto Wands will still be promoting, with Tatanka and Remo, Luke Poirier, formerly Sniper in WWF, coming in as the headliners. The Australasian Wrestling Federation promoted weekend shows around Australia featuring Sabu, Chris Candido, Tammy Sitch and Marty Jannetty as headliners along with Alberta wrestler Gothic Knight and former Pancrase wrestler Greg Von Stecker. August 28 in Sydney drew about 1,000 with Sabu vs. Candido on top. The match was a disappointment with Sabu slipping off the chair during one high spot and the table collapsing before he could break it. Apparently Sabu was far more impressive on the first show of the tour on August 26 in Newcastle. On August 29 in Geelong, Candido and Sitch both missed the show and it was announced they were both injured. Candido did bleed the night before from a hard chair shot. Jannetty subbed in the main event on the show which drew only 320. August 30 in Camberwell saw Sabu beat Candido with Sitch in the main event before 800 fans. MMA, the UFC has announced its planned lineup for the September 24 pay-per-view show from Lake Charles, Louisiana. It's basically a low-budget show as it's pretty well acknowledged UFC is going to try and book strong main events within a budget and fill the cards out with guys who are willing to work cheap, so the name value of the lineups as a whole aren't going to be looking impressive. With UFC not having the votes to be approved in Nevada, there doesn't appear anything on the short-term horizon to change the fortunes of this group, so at this point it looks to be a bare-bones operation. The Frank Shamrock vs. Tito Ortiz middleweight title match, which among serious UFC fans is probably the most looked forward to match in a long time. Ortiz, who will have a distinct advantage in size, reach and in wrestling ability, claimed in Full Contact Fighter that he'd give Shamrock $10,000 if Shamrock could beat him. The other matches as planned are Jeremy Horn vs. Jason Godsey, who has been working Pancrase but is 0-1 in UFC. As a heavyweight fight, Horn had been competing as a middleweight. Brad Kohler, indie pro wrestler who was arrested on steroid charges a few months back, from the Twin Cities, who has also done numerous shoot fights including a loss to Trey Teligman in UFC Japan and placed in the 1996 Olympic trials as a Greco-Roman heavyweight wrestler, versus Heath Herring, a big wrestler from the USWF who once beat Evan Tanner. Teligman, Lions Den vs. Marcus Conan Silveira, former EFC heavyweight champion who was a big name in the primitive years of this sport. Paul Jones, USWF light heavyweight champion, versus Chuck Liddell, a tough wrestler / kickboxer who has a 1-1 UFC record. Matt Hughes, who I know little about, versus Val Ignatov, a Sama champion training under Bob Shamrock that got hammered in his UFC debut by Tanner. John Lewis, a Jean LaBelle black belt who once hammered Ruben Asado in Japan and got knocked out in Olympic gold medalist Kenny Monday's only NHB match, versus Lowell Anderson, a Hickson Gracie black belt, and Jens Pulver versus Alfonso Alcaraz in a battle of 150-pounders, which may be a prelude to starting a new weight class. The follow-up show at this point looks to be November 5, headlined by Kevin Randleman versus Pete Williams for the vacant heavyweight championship. The current champ, Boss Rutan, is vacating the title. Read that and isn't interested in a rematch with Randleman, who he got a very lucky decision over, and will instead face the Shamrock Ortiz winner in a middleweight title match later in the year. On this card, Horn replaces Andre Roberts, who has decided to retire from real fights and is attempting to hook on with the WWF. He has some indie pro wrestling experience in the Midwest or another pro wrestling group. Matchmaker John Peretti put together a Pedro Rizzo vs Gary Goodridge fight, but it was dropped due to the tightening of the budget. Goodridge declined a match against Mark Kerr for the September 12th Pride show. The Pride lineup has been finalized with, added to the matches listed here last week, Nobuhiko Takada vs Alexander Otsuka, Enson Inoue vs Tuli Kulihapai, Bronco Siketic vs Maurice Smith, Daijiro Matsui vs Bob Schreiber, Kazushi Sakuraba vs Anthony Macias, Wanderlei Silva vs Karl Malenko, Akira Shoji vs Larry Parker, and Kerr vs Igor Vovchanchyn. The Kerr match pits the two heavyweights with the most impressive win/loss records, as Kerr is something like 15-0 and Vovchanchyn something like 27-1. Nevertheless, this show doesn't long strong for Japan as a ticket seller, as Otsuka isn't considered a main event draw and Takada's drawing power has been burned out with him being exposed in this world. It appears from the booking, with Sakuraba and Silva put in matches they should be expected to win, and history has shown up that you can never book things in this business with certainty. They are trying to give each a win to set up a match between the two of them. Certainly Macias, who has not fared well against name competition in the past, shouldn't be expected to do any better against Sakuraba. Over the past 2 weeks, this promotion contacted Victor Quiñones, the WWF's international rep who was in Japan, about using WWF wrestlers, Steve Williams, a big star in Japan in the past, Steve Blackman and Tiger Ali Singh, since his father was a pro wrestling legend in Japan, as potential opponents for Kerr, Sakuraba and Silva in matches that were told to the WWF would be shoots and not works. As you can imagine, the WWF turned the offer down without giving it much thought, as Brawl for All has taught them every lesson they need to learn about pro wrestling doing shoots. Although Malenko and Otsuka on this show are pro wrestlers in Japan, although they train at shooting, and Takada, no matter how they try and level him, is and has always been a pro wrestling drawing card, while Sakuraba was originally a pro wrestler, both because they can often look bad, and maybe more important, because of the high risk of injury. UFC lightweight champ Pat Miletich won a 20 minutes decision over Shoni Carter in the main event of a show in Davenport, Iowa before 1,800 fans. The August 22nd K1 show, headlined by Mike Bernardo vs Ray Sefo and Andy Hug vs Maurice Smith, drew a 14.9 rating in the Tokyo metro area and a 14.5 rating in the Osaka metro area, which is a great number, particularly since it aired on NTV instead of Fuji Network. The first round of the K1 Grand Prix on October 3rd at the Osaka Dome will be Masaaki Sadake vs Musashi, Hug vs Nobu Hayashi, Peter Eats vs Lloyd Van Damme, Sam Greco vs Stefan Liko, Nesto Hoost vs Jabbat Bayrami, Ray Sefo vs Samir Benuzuz, Mike Bernardo vs Rick Rufus, and Jerome LeBanner vs Oleg Sarakin. ECW. The biggest news is that Raven agreed to a 1-year deal. Raven was earning approximately $275,000 on his WCW contract, and took an ECW deal believed to be in the range of $150,000 for the year. He had told friends he'd finish up the time frame of his WCW contract in ECW before going to WWF, but in the ECW dressing room, noted that his original plan years ago was to work 4 months in ECW before moving on, and he ended up staying 3 years. Paul Heyman spoke highly about Billy Kidman, but the bottom line was that Kidman had 3 years left on his WCW contract and was making $300,000, a figure Heyman couldn't afford to come close to. He also wasn't interested in spending 3 years in ECW before getting the opportunity to go to WWF. Heyman wasn't as interested in Konnan, and financially it would have been a dumb move for Konnan to make, although it may have been considered more than momentarily. Raven did try to broker a deal because he felt Konnan could contribute because of his booking ideas. The September 19th pay-per-view show from Villa Park, Illinois looks to be Taz vs Masato Tanaka, FMW's Independent World Heavyweight Champion, in an ECW title match. Rob Van Dam vs Johnny Smith, who debuted on August 26th at the ECW Arena. Jerry Lynn vs Lance Storm, Sabu vs Justin Credible, a 3-way with Super Crazy, Little Guido and Yoshihiro Tajiri, in a tag title match with Raven and Tommy Dreamer doing the Reluctant Partners gimmick. It's almost a lock this should be one of the best pay-per-view shows of the year, because too many people would all on the same night have to have unusually bad performances for at least a few of the matches not to be very good. Axel Rotten and New Jack are both back as a full-timers. It's said that Chris Condito and Tammy Sitch will return on September 11th in Buffalo. In Weekly Fight this past week, the cover story was that ECW was trying to bring in Kenta Kobashi and Manukia Mossman. Actually, Heyman was trying to also bring in Vader. The Japanese-based story said that Mossman wasn't interested because the money offer was low. Paul Heyman said he's gotten approval that he can use Mossman in September if he wants him. since All Japan isn't running any shows after September 4th. There was truth to the talk about Kobashi, but no indication it's going to happen. As things stand, upcoming TNN tapings are September 11th in Buffalo, September 25th in Detroit, and September 30th in Spartanburg, South Carolina. The first TNN show opened with them showing Balls Mahoney going through the flaming tables, so they opened with the most shocking footage to an outsider that they probably have. They aired a clip of Van Dam vs. Lynn from Hardcore Heaven with a new voiceover by Joey Styles added, which was good because the other companies don't air 20-minute matches of that caliber virtually ever. In a hotline tease, they noted that the Warrior, Jim Hellwig, had talked about ECW. Mr. Don't Call Me Jim Hellwig wrote a rambling post saying he's interested in ECW, but after the mess of attempts to bring in a real star happen time after time with Sid, this has even less upside and far bigger downsides. Actually, the most exposed wrestler on the first show was Kevin Nash, whose Monster Madness commercial was all over the show. ECW tried to get itself over, probably trying too hard, by emphasizing the names out of its history: Malenko, Benoit, Douglas, Terry Funk, Bigelow, Eddie Guerrero, and even Steve Austin. It's good to try and use the rub from some of the guys to make the guys on top seem like big players, but it backfired because when they made a point of saying how Austin wanted the ECW title more than anything and could never get it, it came off more as if ECW is a place that its stars leave to become, with the exception of Austin, mid-card guys in the big companies. This was emphasized in showing Hawk, Douglas, and Raven as its former world champs. It was also interesting to see just how much smaller Austin was when he was in ECW, and how Shane Douglas has aged at least 15 years in the last 5 when they showed the clip of a very young-looking Douglas throwing down the NWA belt. The Sabu push was as embarrassing as a WCW angle, maybe more since Heyman knows better, trying to push that he's banned from wrestling in the US when he wrestles in the US virtually every weekend, which only tells its hardcore fan base, which ECW lives by more than any other company, that they're being lied to no different from WCW angles. They pushed clips to introduce the other talent. It was interesting to see the former Dawn Marie bitch as simply Dawn Marie, and when she introduced herself as DMB, the bitch was edited out, and when she spelled it BYTCH, they edited out her saying BY. Taz then talked about how he had beaten Millennium Man Jericho, Douglas, Bigelow, Scorpio, Condito, and Lawler. He did a good interview, and it was good for a first show to position the belt as the biggest thing in the company, so when Van Dam goes for it, it's a mountain to climb rather than pushing Van Dam on the first television show, positioning him as the biggest star, which everyone knows he really is. August 26th in Queens and August 28th at ECW Arena sold out to the tune of about 1,000 and 1,500 respectively. August 27th in Lebanon, Pennsylvania drew about 300. At the ECW Arena, Taz again challenged anyone in any company, I guess to build up Tanaka as a star from outside the promotion. Johnny Smith debuted to mixed reviews, beating Guido. Spike Dudley beat PN News in about 30 seconds, but it was said to be such a hot 30 seconds that News may become a regular. Crazy beat Tajiri in a good match. Rotten beat Mahoney, and after the match they embrace, so they'll probably be put back together. Van Dam vs. Storm won about 2 minutes, since Storm is still injured, before it turned into a brawl with Smith, who apparently will become aligned with the Impact Playas, and just incredible attacking Van Dam with Lynn saving him, also getting beaten up in the process. Van Dam said the people were being screwed by not seeing him in a match and asked Lynn to wrestle him. The first half of the match was just okay, ending when Lynn was injured and they teased stopping the match. Lynn came back a la McMahon in the cage match with Austin and Foley in the Hell in the Cell, and apparently it was like an All Japan finish with near fall after near fall and the crowd going crazy before Van Dam won. The show ended with Raven and Dreamer making quick work of Rhino and Jack victory, with them both doing the crucifix at each other and Raven spitting in Dreamer's direction. Tajiri is leaving for a few weeks to return to Japan but will be back for the pay-per-view. Douglas is claiming that he's owed $140,000 and threatened to sue. Paul Heyman is saying he won't take Public Enemy back because they no-showed Queens to put the Dudleys over a few months back, and he won't take Hawk back because Hawk walked out without finishing up, and then threatened legal action over money which Heyman claimed he didn't owe him and said the lawyers shut down his claim. WCW. Current lineup for the Fall Brawl pay-per-view on September 12th in Winston-Salem, North Carolina is Hogan vs. Sting for the WCW title, Benoit vs. Sid for the US title, Goldberg vs. Page, Steiner vs. Saturn for the TV title, Wyndham's vs. Heat for the tag titles, Berlin vs. Bagwell, Danny Lane vs. Kaz Hayashi for the Cruiserweight title, Malenko and Douglas vs. Knobs and Morrison, Kidman and Mysterio Jr. and Eddie Guerrero, who may be called the Filthy Animals by this point, versus ICP and Vampiro. This is where the past sins come home to roost. After year drawing sellouts for Fall Brawl in the market and making the favorite horseman look like crap and the fans leaving pissed off, for a traditional pay-per-view show in the market with less than 2 weeks before show time, only 2,200 tickets have been sold. Advances for virtually all the upcoming shows, including the ones with Goldberg vs. Sid main events, are shockingly weak. The plan is for Sid to beat Benoit for the US belt and hold off the Goldberg match, and keep him unbeaten, for months. The plan had been to go with Hogan vs. Hart as the main event for Halloween Havoc, but it appears that has changed because of the feeling it would be Hogan, who this moment isn't planned on being turned. You know how the Luger angle goes, where it turns out he's the one who double-crosses Sting at the end. Of course these things change hourly, would have 2 straight pay-per-view main events against babyfaces, and he's already getting booed after the brief red and yellow honeymoon. Maybe it'll be Hogan vs. Luger rushed. There are far less people on TV chanting for Goldberg when Sid does his interviews than it appears. A lot of those chants are being piped in over the PA at this point. Plans are being formulated with the idea that Flair isn't coming back. August 30th, Nitro at the Nassau Coliseum before 10,605, 8,210 paying $283,985, was one of those shows leaving you shaking your head. Regal and Taylor no contest disorderly conduct in 144, Sid attacked everyone. This match was so bad I was hoping he'd come out even sooner. For those keeping track, now he's 75-0. Sid's interview made no sense. He kept saying over and over again, there's no end. Kind of like the feeling watching 3 hours of Nitro. They showed the kid from the Lodi Nitro party at the gate waiting for his hero Lodi to show up. Luger did an interview and said before the show was over he was going to expose Hogan for the phony that he is. I figured Zahorian was being brought in for a promo. He said he'd have evidence by the end of the show. Scotty Riggs beat Lash LaRue in 3:53 with a rocker dropper. Fans were chanting for Sid to end this. Vampiro and ICP came out for the first of their million appearances. They just watched, but after Vampiro said that Riggs owed him. Riggs didn't know what for. I guess with Raven gone, they are trying to recruit new members into the dead pool. If there are too many guys like Riggs in there, it will be a dead pool. Revolution came out to a very tepid crowd response. Somehow as a quartet these guys have major negative charisma and it's killing Benoit in particular to be associated with them. Kaz Hayashi beat Lodi when after a ref bump, he pinned Lenny Lane with an inside cradle in 3:59 to begin the angle where he challenges for the Cruiserweight belt. I believe they are giving Hayashi the push largely to rub it in the face of the Cruiserweights who are in the doghouse and complain about not getting pushed. Hayashi is really good, but Lodi was exposed here because there were a lot of missed moves. Hogan did an interview. He got a good pop the first time out, which is more than could be said later in the show. Piano music was playing. They never showed Robbie Kellum, who I believe will be called the Maestro. The least they could have done if they wanted a wrestler with that name was bring in Blue Panther, which is a lucha joke that some of you will get. Kellum owned the rights to the name Gorgeous George III, and WCW bought those rights from him originally to give to Lenny Poffo years ago but never wound up using him. Poffo is still under a $75,000 per year contract with the company, and gave the name to Savage's girlfriend. I wonder if 40 years from now there will be a female valet in wrestling called Hulk Hogan. Actually, I bet there will be. Rey Mysterio Jr. and Eddie Guerrero beat La Parka, who if he gains any more weight should be renamed Brasso Parka, which is another lucha joke, and Blitzkrieg, who subbed for Psicosis who no-showed for whatever reason. This was the only good match on the show and the best match of the night. Vamp and ICP came out. Blitzkrieg did some unreal flying. Mysterio Jr. and Guerrero were really good, particularly in the spots at the end. The live crowd, which by this point was wanting to hate everything, actually liked this. Guerrero pinned Blitzkrieg in 3:52 with a frog splash. Gene interviewed Berlin, Alex Wright, with an entourage of a blonde interpreter named Uta Ludendorff, an actress who with the exception of messing up her closing line was tremendous. After people like Sable, Chyna, and Terry Runnels, I'm so used to watching women on wrestling who can't act or deliver a line to save their life, and this was shocking to see a real actress out there, and a bunch of security guards. One of them patted down Gene, which was hilarious, and very little of humor on WCW is the intentional kind. Too bad they didn't find handcuffs or something funny when they were searching him. This was a tremendous introduction of a new character and he got real heat from a standoffish audience. The only negative is him saying he's after Bagwell. Now there's nothing wrong with him killing Bagwell in his first match. Apparently Bagwell is also being punished, although he may complain the day of the show because the right thing to do is to put Berlin over as a killer in a squash to build him up to where he may mean something, But he should establish his goal as Hogan or Sting if they wanted people to take him seriously as a top guy. Now, even with the strong debut, people see him as a middle guy. And they interviewed a disheveled Luger who claimed Hogan jumped him backstage. The Wyndhams beat Kenny Chaos and Prince Iaukea in 2 minutes when Kendall pinned Iaukea after a knee to the throat, which certainly didn't appear to be the finish. Barry never tagged in once. Then they challenged Harlem Heat to come out. They did and brawled. Kendall and Booker T's stuff was good, but Barry and Stevie Ray set a new meaning for the word bad. Duncombe Jr. ran in and they hog-tied Booker T. It's so hilarious to see Kurt Hennig as a Southern-born, Southern-bred, and when I die I'll be Southern dead good old boy. I mean, except for Nome, Alaska, the North Pole and the wilds of the Yukon, Robbinsdale, Minnesota isn't south of anywhere. Lex came out for a third interview and asked for Sting to come out so he could show the proof. He showed a photo of Hogan standing by a white Hummer. Hogan limped out to a light response of mainly boos and started protesting. Sting's mad because Nash, who has turned on him a billion times, got run into by someone and Nash was fined 3 days later. Never sold the angle much in the first place, and if he doesn't care and the ratings showed that none of the fans cared, why should Sting care? Besides, why should Sting think a photo of Hogan standing by a Hummer should mean anything when Sting was in the Hummer itself when Nash saw him and turned on him the last time? DDP punched Hogan and left. Hogan and Sting had a pull apart. Anyway, for those of you who have been waiting since 1986 to see what Baby Doll had in that envelope, now I bet you're glad you never found out. Buff Bagwell beat Van Hammer in 4:58 with a blockbuster. Berlin's guys were taking notes. Boring match since Hammer stinks. Evan Karagi's beat Mike Enos in 4:26. By this point in time, it was unbelievable they'd even send out a match like this. Enos is twice Karagi's size and Karagi's is so green. Once Enos lifted him up and refused to pin him, it was a dead giveaway he was doing the job. Vamp and ICP came out again and Vamp interfered, giving Enos the spike and put Karagi's on top for the pin. 0 pop for the upset. Fans were chanting "We want puppies" during this match. Vamp told Karagi's that he owed him. The Demon, Bryan Adams, came out of his box to challenge Vamp. I believe Vamp was offered a 5-year contract. Douglas and Malenko double count out Knobs and Morris in 3:54. Douglas did a plancha. Fans really hated the non-finish and the match was really bad. Malenko is just too small and doesn't do anything in a comeback spectacular enough for fans to get into a hot tag against these guys so much bigger than himself. Malenko was a great cruiserweight champion, but the only way to keep smaller guys over is to protect them in booking from situations where they look small, and WCW has never figured that out after all these years. Hogan came out and thanked the fans for their support. They responded by booing him anyway. He said next week he'd prove Luger was wrong and challenged Page to a singles match. He asked Goldberg to come out and wanted to take Goldberg's place. The fans booed this, figuring they wouldn't see Goldberg wrestle, and they were sick of Hogan by this point. Goldberg suggested a 2-on-3 main event. Not much of a pop for that suggestion either. Disco came out and acted like he was a superstar. Steiner came out and then destroyed him in a TV title match with a sky-high bulldog in 141. Steiner continued to destroy him after the match until Saturn made the save. They slugged it out like two guys in a tough man contest. It was so well done it looked real. Steiner was tagging Saturn for about 10 and 15 seconds. I know wrestlers in the company who thought it was real and that Steiner was sending a message to Saturn, who fashions himself as a tough guy, and everyone knows Steiner is really tough. I'm still not sure. After Steiner potatoed Saturn a half dozen times, Saturn finally sidekicked him out of the ring. Benoit beat Flynn via DQ in 4:33. Good match, but it was mind-blowing that Benoit can't even get a clean win over Flynn. The First Family interfered and the Revolution made the save. Benoit challenged Sid to a title match. Hogan and Goldberg beat the Triad in 5:08 when Hogan leg dropped Bigelow. At the same time, Goldberg had speared Canyon, but Page hit Goldberg with a chair and hit the Diamond Cutter, but Goldberg got right up from it. The show ended with Sting opening the door to Hogan's dressing room and being shocked when he saw Savage and George there, so they're back. Gene Simmons of KISS did an interview where he said he went with WCW instead of WWF because of Bischoff's integrity. I guess they didn't learn from the rating after all. WCW has added a New Year's Eve pay-per-view from the Fiesta Bowl in Tempe, Arizona, the 70,000-seat stadium, which will be a combination full-length wrestling show and a full-length KISS concert. Boy, are the wrestlers going to be pissed having to spend the biggest New Year's Eve in history working. Universal Soldier opened at number 7 in the box office charts with a $4.3 million gross, which isn't good. Conan and Kidman are in the major doghouse, but both are staying. Kidman will be asked to do a squash job for Sid. Both were at Nassau and not used on television. Konnan was told that he won't be on television until the pay-per-view. Gene Okerlund on the 900 line, where Gene makes up 90% of the info but people still take it as gospel, reported that Konnan was fired so people were believing it. As it turned out on Thunder, they did show the Harlem Heat match, just edited out the entrance where the belts were shown. When Bischoff goes heel as company president, he's going to have a black woman bodybuilder and 2 midgets as part of his entourage. When Bischoff gave Raven his release, he told him he admired his guts to walk out and ask for it because he didn't expect that anyone would. They basically agreed that Raven wouldn't say anything bad about WCW as a term of getting the release, and that in 1 year, when Raven's ECW deal is up, he'd be welcome back to WCW. Chastity was given word that when her contract expires in December that she won't be renewed. That's why Hawk was ready to leave for ECW and has said he still wants to, although Heyman said he's not welcome back. After the first TNN rating, I think anyone Heyman thinks can get over if they were really available would be welcome back. Nash was at the Nassau show doing a lot of the booking along with Rhodes. From the WCW Saturday night tapings on August 31st in Binghamton, New York, Barry Darsow worked wearing one of his old Russian outfits. Kidman worked on the taping beating Blitzkrieg in a short match where they did no high spots. Duggan got a huge pop since he grew up in nearby Glens Falls. ICP did an interview saying they were going to remain in WCW forever. Mysterio Jr. and Chavo Jr. worked as a tag team and did an angle where they are teasing problems between them and Eddie comes in as the peacemaker. It was amazing watching the Tijuana show on Thursday and seeing people like Psicosis and Guerrera garnering tons more heat than Hogan or anyone in WCW can. Christian York and Joey Matthews were told they didn't have to move to Atlanta or go to the power plant yet, but they'll probably have to start going in 6 months. For now they are getting paid for doing nothing. It's expected that Super Calo will be fired. The actual attendance at the August 23rd Nitro in Las Vegas was 8,940, paying $173,916. On the August 16th Nitro, with the Goldberg vs. Wyndham match, it was scheduled as Goldberg vs. Hennig, but Hennig disappeared from backstage. Rodman was arrested on August 21st on a misdemeanor public intoxication charge. What a shock, huh? He was taken to jail and released the next morning and has an arraignment October 1st. Flair and Goldberg joined such celebs as Michael Jordan for the Jimmy V, for the late famous college basketball coach Jimmy Valvano of North Carolina State who died from cancer, Celebrity Golf Classic over the weekend in Cary, North Carolina. It was said that Goldberg had a following for autographs that rivaled Jordan. Of the 101 celebrities in attendance, they had the largest followings, but the top-selling auction item was a Flair robe at $28,000, sold to Darius Rucker, the lead singer of Hootie and the Blowfish. WWF, there is nothing definitive for the September 26th Unforgiven pay-per-view. At one point the main event was going to be a four-way with Triple H, Rock, Mankind and Undertaker for the title, and it still may be, but as of the tapings this week nothing was made clear. It appears they are doing a Jericho vs. Shamrock match and Jarrett vs. Chyna for the IC belt, but nothing else seems completely certain. Raw on August 30th at the Fleet Center in Boston before a sellout 13,644 paying $315,557 opened with Rock challenging Triple H to come out. When he didn't, Rock went backstage after him. He was looking but Triple H and Chyna and Shane all tripled on him backstage until Mankind made the save. Shane did an interview saying that Rock and Mankind would both be given matches, and if either won, they'd be the #1 contender for Triple H. He announced Mankind vs. Posse 3-on-1 and Undertaker, who is actually not wrestling at all right now because he's got a torn groin, versus Rock at a Falls Count Anywhere. Posse beat Mankind via DQ in 4:25. Mankind had them beat but Shane as ref wouldn't count. He put the Socko Claw on Shane for the DQ. Triple H made the save but ended up with the claw on him. With the exception of the main event, the crowd was dead for every TV match, and even with Mankind, this was no exception. Mankind looked real bad in the ring, although it's probably considered blasphemous these days to say what is painfully obvious. He's moving very slow, is way too heavy and the knees haven't recovered. Working with the Posse was no bargain either. Lillian Garcia announced that Mankind had won and Shane had to run back and correct her. Since Garcia has botched up so many announcements in her 2 weeks, I'd presume it was a planned spot, but you never know. Undertaker ordered Show to wrestle Rock instead. Crowd was dead for this one. Taker interfered, allowing Show to choke-slam Rock through the announcer's table for the win in 3:37. Garcia then announced Undertaker as the winner of the match. Somebody needs to buy her a clue. Triple H came out after Rock but Taker snatched him, but Mankind came out and Show and Taker concentrated on laying him out, allowing Triple H to escape. Snow did an interview and it sounded like two people were having sex behind the stage. Boss came out and called out Snow, apologized and said he'd give him back pepper at SmackDown at his hotel room. X-Pac beat Taka Michinoku in 3:05 with the X Factor. Very good action but no heat. Michinoku looked better than X-Pac. Sho Funaki kept interfering and after the match X-Pac used the X Factor on Funaki. X-Pac left the ring still mad about being the weak link, basically intimating it was nothing to beat up little guys because he wants to be able to beat up big guys. A four-way with Christian and Edge, Acolytes, Hardy Boys and Hollies ended in a no contest in 2:04 when Mideon and Viscera, Draws and Prince Albert and Stevie Richards and Blue Meanie ran out. Jeff Hardy took a flip bump into the stairs and smashed into a piece of the table. The fans live groaned at the non-finish. WCW fans are way past tired of this, but this was the first indication WWF fans are as well. Jarrett and Henry beat Brown and Gunn in 3:37 when Chyna went to hit Jarrett with the guitar, but hit Gunn instead and Jarrett pinned him. Chyna did the commentary with that voice from another solar system. Test asked Patterson and Briscoe to both be his best man at the wedding. I'm sure there's a joke there somewhere, but I haven't figured it out yet. The only thing I can think of is that Test must have no real friends. Anyway, I smell a lot of trouble at this wedding. Shamrock beat Gangrel in 5:24 with a knee bar. Shamrock chased Finkel away after the match when Jericho did an interview on the Titantron challenging Shamrock to a match on SmackDown. Ivory did an interview and called Tori a slut. They didn't edit slut out the first time, but times 2 through 9 where she said, slut, slut, slut. You get the picture, were edited out. Tori jumped Ivory. Luna and Jacqueline showed up. Great, a four-way stripper match is coming on pay-per-view. Ivory and Tori wound up with their shirts torn up and bras showing. Finally, Rock and Mankind won the tag titles from Undertaker and Show in 8:12. Taker never tagged in and finally Bearer came out and left with Taker leaving Show alone. Show slammed Foley hard on the floor. Show choke slammed Rock but Rock kicked out. Show missed an elbow. After a ref bump, Rock delivered a hard chair shot to Show and Rock and Mankind delivered a double people's elbow and Rock pinned him. Finish got a good pop but Show has retrogressed a lot as a worker over the past 18 months, and Rock couldn't carry him and Mankind looked terrible in there with him. On August 31st in Worcester, Massachusetts, it opened with Kurt Angle beating Michinoku in a dark match. They taped matches for Heat, most of which were said to be good action matches and longer matches than Heat used to have, with Brown over Gangrel, Dudley's over Richards and Meanie. Meanie accidentally tripped over Richards and stepped on his face, and he bled in an unplanned spot, with 3D on Meanie. Chaz beat Meat via DQ and Mariana tripped Chaz and then Terry came out and they fought to the back and rolled down the ramp together and finally Abs beat Papi Chulo. SmackDown, with Lawler and Cole as announcers, geez, if they elect Lawler, when is he ever going to find time to work as mayor? Opened with Chyna beating Gunn in 3:26 for the IC title shot. Jarrett, Deborah and Kitty were doing commentary. Ref bump, Gunn hit the famouser but Triple H ran in and used the pedigree on Gunn and put Chyna on top. Show came out and said Taker was full of crap and challenged him to come out and fight. Bearer came out instead and Show destroyed him. Taker came out and instead of saving Bearer just watched and said that showed him Show was getting a killer instinct but warned Show if he ever disrespected him again that he'd beat him up. Mankind did an interview saying losing to Shane was the most embarrassing moment of his career. Hey, what about those TV jobs to Eric Watts and Van Hammer? He and Rock praised each other and Shane came out and ordered them to wrestle each other and if they didn't he'd suspended them for 60 days. Shane also ordered Triple H to defend the title against the bald-headed sob, making people think it was Austin, but wound up being Gilbert. Speaking of Austin, apparently he told his ex-wife that his knee was shot and he'd be out of action indefinitely. Midweek, after the rating for Raw came in lower than it had been doing, plans were made for Austin to return at this set of tapings and there was also some talk of him doing the pay-per-view. By the weekend, those plans had changed and he probably won't be at the tapings next week either and his name isn't really pushed that much. They had a tuxedo match with Tony Chamel, the SmackDown ring announcer, beating Finkel in 1:56 by ripping his clothes off and leaving him in his underwear. If Finkel won, he'd get his ring announcing job back. Jericho then joked that Finkel should model Y2J underwear. X-Pac NC Jericho. It was announced on Raw it would be Shamrock. Shamrock came out but X-Pac asked him to let him have the match for revenge for Road Dogg from last week. They had a hot match for 3:41. Undertaker and Show came out and Undertaker told Show to run in. Jericho left and Show was about to kill X-Pac when Kane made the save. X-Pac got mad at Kane for the frustration of needing to be saved and wouldn't shake Kane's hand. Shamrock spent the next hour chasing Jericho backstage. Triple H beat Gillberg in 152. Gillberg did 2 spears, missed a third, and got pedigreed. Triple H and Chyna were laughing at him. They didn't show to the live audience the hotel room angle with Bossman and Snow. Mankind vs. Rock with Shane as ref ended in a no contest with Triple H and Chyna interfering freely, so neither earned the title shot. Shamrock beat Venus in 2:14 with the ankle lock. Blackman ran in but Shamrock laid him out as well. Jericho was on the ramp and challenged Shamrock to a street fight. Shamrock went outside and started pounding on who he thought was Jericho, but it was Finkel dressed up in Jericho's clothes. This allowed Jericho to attack Shamrock with a shovel and leave him laying. He drove off and basically stuffed Finkel in the trunk when he left and said, "Oh my God, I killed Kenny." Shane, Triple H and Chyna did an interview when Test came out with his future bride and future mother-in-law, who between them have controlling interest with Vince not around. Linda ordered Shane and Triple H to face Rock and Mankind, and Shane agreed as long as it was a title match. They did another series of matches with the Ultimate winners becoming top contenders for the tag titles. Hollies beat Midian and Viscera. Hollies beat Draws and Albert. Hardys beat Hollies. Acolytes beat Hardys. Acolytes beat Richards and Meanie. Came down to Acolytes versus Gangrel and Edge when the Dudleys laid both teams out with 2x4s. Bob Bud did an interview and was back doing his stuttering gimmick. Devon did the same interview he did with ECW except Thou Shalt Not 3 stars with the Dudleys was changed to Mess. Mankind and Rock kept the tag titles beating Shane and Triple H in 6:58. Earl Hebner was bumped. Gunn ran in and used the famouser on Triple H allowing Rock to score the pin on him after a people's elbow. Dog will be out of action for 2 months to record a CD and the injury was a cover story. Ross and Lawler did the first week on SmackDown after WWF originally announced Cole and Kelly would be doing the show, and the second week was Cole and Lawler. McMahon made the call basically at the last minute because he wanted more backstoryline, figuring a lot of viewers would be watching the new show and figured Ross with his experience could pull it off better. WWF is very close to signing Sylvester Turkey, who worked in Japan as UFO Big Van Vader, and Oleg Toktarov of UFC fame to developmental deals. They are looking at bringing back Curtis Hughes in a bodyguard role. He's said to be down from 380 to 280 and been given a clean bill of health. He'd had a lot of problems in the past. There is talk of WWF trying to get ECW to use Vic Grimes to give him more experience, since he isn't ready yet. Austin is scheduled to be off appearing in any wrestling matches until October 10th. A correction regarding the Austin item on Nash Bridges, as it was reported everywhere. Austin is not doing 5 sweeps episodes for November, but has agreed to do 5 shows, not in a row, during the current season. The Davey Boy Smith interviews that were thought to start after SummerSlam haven't aired at all. There is some discussion as to what will and won't be allowed on the air due to the lawsuit and because there was a lot of controversial things said. The current plan, not finalized, would be for Smith to debut on the October 2nd pay-per-view show in England. Unlike the previous England pay-per-view which only had a half crew since they were also running domestic shows that weekend, there will be no domestic shows so all the big names will be going to England. Smith was interviewed in the Calgary Sun and ripped heavily on Bret Hart, with it noting Bret had made sarcastic remarks about Smith going back to work for WWF in his columns in the same paper. Smith claimed that Bret had called up his wife Diana and told her that if he were to see her on the street that he would run her over. He said he was really mad at Bret because he left WWF to go to WCW in support of Bret because of what happened in the infamous match, but that Bret didn't stick up for him when Bischoff fired him. Smith talked about how McMahon brought Davey and Diana in via limo, put them up at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. Hart was mad that the newspaper printed Smith's statements about him threatening to run over his sister without even contacting him, particularly since he writes for that same newspaper. On August 30th he visited the editor for a closed-door meeting to give his side of things, noting because of the lawsuit he couldn't express himself publicly. The newspaper promised him space to give his side and encouraged him to do so, but Martha Hart's lawyers think it's imperative he keeps quiet. Hart in his column said that he couldn't respond to what Smith said for that reason, but that someday he would have the chance to give his side. The Richards and Meanie segments on the Blair Bitch Project mocking Sable were pulled from the first SmackDown, reportedly because McMahon didn't like them, although it may also have been partially for legal reasons since the lawsuit settlement included that neither side could publicly disparage the other. UPN did public service announcements telling kids not to try the wrestling moves that the wrestlers do. We don't have any official numbers, but SummerSlam looks to have done around the same 600,000 buys as last year, which means it won't be anywhere near record levels, although that is a healthy number. Foley's book will be called Have a Nice Day, and should be on the stands in October. Unlike the other WWF bios that are coming out that are written by an author, this book was written by Foley himself while he was out injured. Austin will be on the MTV Video Music Awards on September 9th. Godfather actually missed the pay-per-view not because of his character being raunchy with the media spotlight on because of Ventura but because he had a cyst on his back. Signed Guy Dudley wasn't taken with the other Dudleys, so he'll probably take on a new role in ECW WWF called Jim Neidhart to bring him in. WCW has also expressed interest in Neidhart. What a weird business this is when you're the brother-in-law of a woman involved in a high-profile lawsuit. Supposedly they talked with Neidhart about forming a tag team with Smith as the new Hart Foundation. Rock was going to Memphis this week to campaign for Lawler. WWF wants Foley to drop 50 pounds. Dudley's debuted on The Jax Show taped August 30th in Boston beating Knuckles Nelson and Tim McNeely. They got a nice pop coming out and for their finisher. There were some messed up moves in the match. It was so weird after Ross was taken out in an ambulance on Raw to see him back on SmackDown a few nights later and on Raw again with this little cast and barely even selling injuries. House shows this past week saw the first SmackDown taping in Kansas City on August 24th draw 9,779 paying $321,516. Madison Square Garden on August 28th drew a sellout 16,452 paying $441,848 and August 29th in Philadelphia drew 15,514 paying $381,273 to the Core State Center. Both Kansas City and St. Louis recent shows were below normal current standards, which would still be great houses by the standards of most other time periods, with the belief being because both times in the market previously were the night Owen Hart died in KC and the tribute show the next night. It was said that a lot of the wrestlers and personnel had a really eerie feeling much of the night at the first SmackDown being in Kemper Arena. Arena merchandise over the past week was $360,663 or $6.51 per head. At MSG, Jericho came out to a large mix of cheers and boos with Finkel acting really excited to see him. Shane McMahon worked the show, interfering so Bossman beat Test. Undertaker in show versus X-Pac and Kane saw Taker barely wrestle, but it was still a good match. Shane ran in wearing a ref shirt and fast counted Rock in the main event title match against Triple H, said to have been an excellent card. Rock got an incredible reaction. The Moonlight Bunny Ranch, a legal brothel in Nevada, has named a room the Jesse Ventura Suite, formerly called the Monica Oral Office, because Ventura used to frequent the place when he was a Navy SEAL based out of Southern California. It will be decorated with Navy SEAL and Ventura Pro Wrestling memorabilia, and the ranch said that anyone Navy SEALs who donate items will get free passes, and that Ventura now has a lifetime free pass. Phil Mushnick wrote a column about Ventura's appearance in the August 29th New York Post, largely based on things covered here already, and made fun of his remark about Ventura being against drug testing wrestlers without probable cause, noting that probably no industry has more probable cause evidence of illegal drug use than pro wrestling, and Ventura is well aware of this fact. He also pointed out the dichotomy over George W. Bush taking so much heat from the media the past 2 weeks on the cocaine issue and Ventura not taking heat from the media. Warriors' lawsuit against WWF goes to court in November. Apparently the phone number on Snow's posters to call about Pepper was a rib by Snow. It's actually Val Venus' home phone number, and I'll bet his answering machine has been going crazy over the past week. The Reader's Pages. Hall of Fame. In 10 years, people reading The Observer will think the statement that Shawn Michaels and Mick Foley didn't get into the Hall of Fame in their first year of eligibility was a misprint. If those two don't make it in their first year, I have no idea who deserves to get in. With Michaels, I can see how his reputation may have caused a few people to have neglected to put him on their ballots. That's an excuse, but an unacceptable one. With Foley, I have no idea how he didn't get in last year, let alone this year. Michaels destroyed his body for this business, was a draw, a huge star, a great interview, and the best wrestler of the 90s in North America. Not to take anything away from the Japanese wrestlers, but in that environment with all the talent around, knocking out 4-star matches isn't the hardest thing in the world a lot of the time. Doing it with huge stiffs who have never broken the 2-star barrier is remarkable. As for Foley, I don't know what to say that hasn't already been said. He gives everything to the business and has had some phenomenal matches. His Hell in the Cell match will be remembered by U.S. fans, with only HBK's ladder matches as the defining U.S. matches of the decade. He's been the most entertaining character in WCW, ECW, and WWF. His promos have ranged from hilarious to thought-provoking to dramatic. I could go on and on listing the various accomplishments of these sports entertainers, but I would be telling nobody anything new. Needless to say, it is nothing short of a disgrace they didn't get in the first time they were eligible. All I can imagine is that politics entered into it and the rest stems from nostalgia or some kind of feeling they are too present day to be in. I also can't help but think that if they had wrestled exclusively in Japan, they'd have had the remarkable 95% voting induction that Jushin Liger got. Heaven forbid someone other than a pure Japanese worker dares enter the Hall of Fame. Don't misunderstand me, I love Japanese wrestling and Liger is a true legend and one of my favorite wrestlers, however the bias toward purely foreign workers is becoming a worrying trend. Granted, the wrestlers and the wrestling is a lot better in Japan, but that is no justification in ignoring the US. I can watch tapes of matches from past decades and despite being used to a far higher quality of work, I can recognize the good from the bad and the truly great from the good. While I understand that ring performance doesn't stand as the sole determining factor for inclusion, I know there are wrestlers in the Hall of Fame that were extremely poor performers, even by the standards of their time. Many weren't great draws or even very important. I feel I'm safe in stating there are many wrestlers currently in who deserve it a lot less than Foley and Michaels. To me, Foley and Michaels are living, walking personification of everything that was good about the past decade in wrestling. They are both true total packages, who blend star power with entertaining interviews and fantastic ring work. They have immense cult hero status as well as worldwide stardom and drawing power. They have both had incredibly high work rates, even when the cameras aren't on. The quality of their matches has always been high. They are always entertaining. I'm confident in the decades to come fans will look at the tapes of the 90s and Foley and Michaels will stand out like Fez and Flair. They may not have been the drawing cards that Austin and Hogan are, but Foley and Michaels will be the ones we likely reminisce most fondly about. To those 27 and 29 people respectively who didn't vote for them, I can only ask what someone has to do to get in. If they don't get in, I can't imagine anyone else from the late 90s, a period of one of the largest booms in wrestling ever, deserving to get in. I thought the Hall of Fame was a fantastic idea, and thought getting wrestling greats, current stars and historians and reports to vote would make for a fair system. I don't wish to overreact, however a Hall of Fame without Foley and Michaels inducted the first time they are eligible is just preposterous. I'd like to hear from anyone who didn't vote for them, just to hear their justification. I don't pretend to speak for everyone from my generation, however I'm pretty sure we will do our best to give credit to these fantastic performers in the future when we get to write the history books. They're already pretty much cult legends for the majority of us and I can only imagine their status will grow as the years go by. While this group of experts failed to give them any credit, perhaps the idea that most of the diehard fans who supported wrestling over the past 10 years during the highs and lows consider Foley and Michaels to be Hall of Fame caliber talents. I really hope that next year, the people who are allowed to vote will give Foley and Michaels the credit they deserve. Robert Newland, Sarasota, Florida. There shouldn't be a double standard between Curtis Aokiya and the Dudleys. A reader glorified the fact that Aokiya could incite a riot and brawl with the best. So could the Dudleys, but I'll bet they'll never be in the Hall of Fame. Kevin Convery Jr. Kenmore, New York. Questions. Why does the governor of Minnesota use the name Jesse Ventura instead of using his real name of James Janos? Why does an astute Jewish businessman such as Paul Heyman schedule a pay-per-view on Yom Kippur, which is the solemnest of all Jewish holidays? Why and how has Barry Horowitz lasted as long as he has in his capacity as a career jobber? Why do local indie federations compete and backstab each other instead of sharing wrestlers, transportation costs and rings? Chuck Launderman. Runnymede, New Jersey. Response from Dave Meltzer. James Janos wouldn't have gotten elected governor. Paul Heyman was limited in using Sundays that WWF and WCW hadn't already taken, and obviously he doesn't take his religion as seriously as Sandy Koufax did. Besides, while I consider Heyman a borderline creative genius, I wouldn't call him necessarily an astute businessman. He's more a guy who is creative enough and now surrounds himself with enough smart people who do understand business to overcome his weaknesses from a business standpoint. I can't answer the question about Horowitz as he's a fringe guy who has just gotten jobs because he's professional and not a problem and at one time was a pretty good worker. The answer to the last questions is largely to do with egos. It's always hilarious when local promoters fight each other over whose town it is when WWF and WCW come in and draw 10 times as many people in their town. What on earth was Paul Heyman thinking when he scheduled his pay-per-view on September 19th, when the most holiest of all Jewish holidays, Yom Kippur, starts? As many of us know, the sundown the day before is the actual start of the holiday. Doesn't he realize that many viewers of the Jewish faith like myself will be at their respective homes of worship that evening, thus not being able to watch it? I imagine he'll lose many buys that evening. I may be mistaken, But isn't Heyman of the Jewish faith? Why didn't he schedule the show on another day or even the night before this one time? Steve Glosser, Bronx, New York. You mentioned recently how guys like Vader get $15,000 per week for wrestling full-time in Japan. Does that mean they live in Japan 12 months a year and wrestle a schedule like WWF performers? Or do they work several weeks per year in Japan and spend the rest of their time working independent shows in the US? Bailey Truman, Baltimore, Maryland. Response from Dave Meltzer. Vader's schedule is to work approximately 28 weeks per year in Japan, which means he earns in the range of $420,000. He can work indie dates in between. All Japan somewhat frowns on their top stars working elsewhere, and in particular doing jobs elsewhere. In addition, working All Japan is very physically taxing, and after tours, most of the performers are looking for a break. Finlay. In light of the unfortunate and possible career-ending injury to David Finlay, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge what it is I'll miss about this phenomenal athlete. I've always believed that Finlay was the most underappreciated worker in the industry, both by the fans and by the promoters. His style and work inside the ring was so subtle and understated that nobody really understood how good this man really was. I've watched him have more very good, highly entertaining squash matches on WCW Saturday Night with the likes of Kendall Windham and El Dandy because he was a true pro when it came to the art of working a match. He knew how and well to sell to make his opponent look good, and the matches made sense. He's an old school guy who knows how to draw heat from every little thing he does. He knows how to employ psychology and tell a story in a match. All of this defines the definition of what a good pro wrestler used to be and is supposed to be. Sadly, this is the very reason nobody will know or care that he's no longer around, because he doesn't get it. I'll remember and thank David Finlay for all the years he gave to wrestling, from his matches with Jushin Liger to his classic series of matches with Steven Regal to his TV title reign where he had 1998's best WCW matches with Booker T and Chris Benoit. It's funny, 3 weeks ago on WCW Saturday Night, Mean Gene interviewed Finlay, citing he's one of the purest technicians in the game and why he wanted to resort to competing in the hardcore division. Finlay replied, "Because I have something to prove." Proving it may have cost him his career. But David Finlay proved himself a long time ago, and I wish him nothing short of a speedy recovery and keep whatever is left of traditional wrestling alive. Joshua Christie, Phoenix, Arizona. Power Plant. After concern over what kind of gimmick Chris Jericho would be saddled with, see Ringmaster, Leif Cassidy, The Big Show, I don't think his debut could have been handled better. I hope WCW will finally realize what kind of talent they've lost and will continue to lose if these stupid games continue. Speaking of WCW, there's an article in the current issue of Stuff magazine on the Power Plant. A reporter spent the day there to learn the ropes and included an itinerary of a typical day: 2.5 hours of sit-ups, push-ups, leg lifts, squats, etc., 1.5 hours of running the ropes and taking bumps. The last 30 minutes were spent doing freestyle wrestling. No wonder these guys look so damn good physically and can't do a thing once a match starts. By contrast, on the MTV special, they had a guy wrestling named Rory Fox in his first match who looked worlds better than not only Power Plant guys but some guys who have been around for years. The tributes book was great. However, where was Buzz Sawyer? After seeing some tapes recently, I found that the guy was incredible in Atlanta in the early 80s. His interviews were fantastic as he was very convincing in the role of someone who was just nuts. His work looked good as well. Lastly, Vince McMahon should change Paul White's name to Mr. Ass, or else buy him some new ring tights. Anthony Taylor, Willis, Michigan. Atlas. After watching MTV's True Life, I'm a Pro Wrestler, I find that when it comes to the Tony Atlas story, there are a lot of holes. Tony Atlas gave the budget money to Tom Brandi, which brings up the question as to why Atlas would give a wrestler who doesn't even work the area as a regular the company's budget money. Atlas in the past has overbooked cards, pulled his own power plays, and in other ways has been problematic. The ordeal of him going over budget, again, was basically the icing on the cake. In most independent companies, the promoter and booker and whomever else are running things try to do what's best for business and what's best for the company. All Atlas did was what was best for Atlas. Seeing that Atlas was the one who had the camera crew following him around, who do you think the crew is going to try to have come out smelling like a rose? Had the MTV documentary team actually looked at the whole story before they aired that program, they would have found there was a lot more to the story and they could have told the whole story. But this is yet another example of what happens when mainstream television tries to document a business they don't have the first clue about. Bill Walkowitz, Eastern Wrestling Alliance. Today's wrestling. I found the only defense against the ineptitude of modern wrestling is to not watch it. Going into Road Wild, I had ignored the previous 6 pay-per-view shows. Over the Edge was the first pay-per-view I had ever missed. I've been without watching Monday Night Wrestling for months. I didn't mean for this to happen, but after missing the first one, I felt so clean that I continued. I did watch Road Wild. I was tricked into thinking Hogan might retire for a few months. Road Wild is probably one of the most consistent PPVs. It's always bad. When in our society did bikers become good guys? I remember them as villains in Clint Eastwood movies after Indians and Mexicans got enough political clout that the movie studios couldn't abuse them anymore. I enjoyed Hogan leg-dropping Kevin Nash. If Hogan would stick to pinning guys I hate, he could stay champion forever. They should book him in retirement matches against Savage, Page, Miller, Knobs, Barbarian, Disco Inferno, Bagwell, Piper, Stevie Ray, Rodman, Gorgeous George, David Flair, Mang Medusa, Sonny Ono, Tony Schiavone, Mil Mascaras, and finally Eric Bischoff. That would fill up at least 2 weeks of television. I know they want to set up Goldberg versus Sid, but they didn't need to kill off a major face to set it up. The people want to be Sid squashed and then they want him to leave. I couldn't believe they are having Shane Douglas start out as a face. Nobody in the history of wrestling has killed a new talent like WCW. It doesn't seem like I missed much, so I think I'll miss some more. Can you explain to me how Jesse Ventura could possibly disgrace the office of governor of Minnesota when the voters of that state already accomplished the task by electing him? Steve Yohei. Montebello, California. I'm in a love/hate relationship with what I watch as wrestling on television. I love to read about the various intricacies of wrestling. It has become a rather fascinating world with sick overtones. Linking roller derby with wrestling is a natural. Roller derby used to come on after wrestling at the Chase in the old days and was actually my personal favorite of the two. I won't go into my shock when I realized its non-authenticity while attending a live game. It was a tear-jerker. Jim Ricks, St. Louis, Missouri. _ Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,